3 hours before the Saravan Cultural Council arrived to challenge Arden Museum's ownership. The museum's brightest scholars were losing a battle against a piece of clay.
We cannot let the council see uncertainty.
Then a soaked 17-year-old girl walked into the lobby, carrying a torn backpack and a volunteer application. Her name was Nadia Reyes.
Are you here for the shelter referral program?
Nadia shook her head. She had not come to ask for help. She had seen a flyer and came to apply as a volunteer.
No, I saw a flyer and came to apply as a volunteer.
But when she glanced at the digital scan of the ancient charter, her expression changed. She stepped closer to the screen.
That tablet is upside down.
The scholars turned toward Nadia in disbelief. Dr. Julian Mercer noticed her claim, not with curiosity, but with immediate contempt.
You are saying every scholar in this building has been reading it wrong?
Dr. Mercer asked where exactly she had learned to read a language trained experts had struggled with for years.
And where exactly did you learn what trained experts could not?
Nadia tightened her grip on her backpack. Then she answered that her mother had taught her everything she knew.
My mother taught me.
Then Nadia looked directly at Mercer and said the name he had hoped never to hear again, Elena Reyes.
Elena Reyes.
For the first time that morning, Dr. Julian Mercer looked afraid. The lobby became so quiet that Nadia could hear rain striking the windows. Mercer called Elena a former employee who had worked briefly as a restoration technician, trying to make Nadia's mother sound insignificant.
Your mother worked here briefly. That is all.
Nadia said the writing was not meant to be read from left to right, and that the marks along the edge were directional guides.
Those marks are not cracks. They tell you where to begin.
Nadia explained that the sentence began at the border and curved inward. Her mother had given that route a name Mercer clearly recognized.
My mother called it the Guardian's Path.
My mother called it the Guardian's Path, Nadia said. The phrase landed heavily. Mercer's expression tightened before he could stop it. The Guardian's Path. It was not a phrase a teenager would have invented. It was not something she could have guessed from a quick glance at the screen. Elena had used those exact words in her notes. They had appeared in the report Mercer had hoped would disappear forever. The junior scholars gathered closer to the monitor. One enlarged the lower border. Another brought up older scans. A third began comparing the marks against a database of known Saravan inscriptions. Their movements became slower and more deliberate. The confidence they had shown before Nadia entered the lobby had begun to dissolve. For weeks, they had been trapped inside one interpretation. They had assumed the tablet was a sale agreement because the museum had always called it one. They had assumed the first line named an owner because every exhibition label, donor brochure, and academic summary said it did. They had not tested the possibility that the first line was being read in reverse. Evelyn Hart noticed the shift. She had been standing near the reception desk moments earlier, balancing a phone call from the board with messages from legal counsel and a growing stack of problems that no one else seemed willing to solve. Evelyn was not a historian. She did not claim to understand ancient languages. Her work was more immediate and less romantic. She managed budgets, staff conflicts, insurance concerns, donors, building permits, public relations disasters, and the 1,000 small emergencies that kept Arden Museum functioning. But she understood risk, and the silence around the research screen was beginning to sound like risk. She ended her call and stepped closer. Her eyes moved from the tablet to Nadia, then from Nadia to Mercer. She asked whether the reading direction had ever been tested, using the border marks as guides. No one answered immediately. That hesitation mattered. Mercer stepped in before the silence became too revealing. He said the team had examined all reasonable possibilities. He reminded Evelyn that the document had been studied by senior experts from several institutions. He warned that a museum facing an international legal challenge could not allow an unverified theory to disrupt months of preparation. He sounded calm, but he was speaking too quickly. Nadia saw it. Owen Blake saw it too. Owen was the security guard who had opened the side entrance for Nadia less than an hour earlier. At first, he had thought she had come inside to get out of the rain. Her jacket was old, her shoes were soaked, and the backpack on her shoulder looked as though it had been repaired more times than most people repaired anything. He had almost sent her away. Now he stood near the edge of the lobby, watching the museum's most respected scholar become unsettled by a phrase from an old notebook. Owen did not know the difference between a trade agreement and a custodial covenant. He did not understand Saravan grammar or ancient border signs, but he knew how people behaved when they were trying to hide fear beneath authority. Nadia continued before Mercer could close the conversation. She explained that the opening symbols did not appear to describe a sale. The grammar was wrong for that. If the border marks were followed, the first sequence became a declaration of protection. The document seemed to describe an object placed into another party's care. It sounded less like ownership and more like responsibility. That difference changed everything. A sale would mean Arden Museum had a legal claim to the relic connected to the charter. A guardianship agreement would mean the museum had only been trusted with it. And if that trust came with conditions, the museum could lose much more than an artifact. It could lose the story it had told the world for generations. The Saravan Cultural Council had spent years arguing exactly that. Their historians believed the relic had never been sold. Their legal advisors believed the museum's claim rested on a mistranslation. Their community had watched as an object tied to their own history, ceremonies, and ancestors became a centerpiece in a foreign institution. The council was not coming to Arden Museum for a polite visit. They were coming to demand answers. Mercer knew that better than anyone. He also knew that if Nadia's interpretation was correct, the charter could become evidence against him. He tried to dismiss her without appearing cruel. He said that ancient texts were filled with ambiguity. He suggested that memories of a parent's research could become distorted over time. He described Nadia's observations as interesting, but incomplete, the kind of thing that should be left to trained professionals. To anyone who did not know him, it might have sounded reasonable, but Nadia heard the message beneath it. You do not belong in this room. You do not understand what you are touching. You should be grateful that we are even listening. For a moment, she felt the old instinct disappear. She had felt it in school when teachers saw the name of the youth shelter on her records. She had felt it at social service offices when adults spoke over her as though she were a problem waiting to be processed. She had felt it at job interviews when people looked at her carefully repaired shoes and decided not to ask another question. Her mother had once told her that poor people were often expected to be grateful just for being allowed inside a room. But Elena had also told her something else. When someone becomes uncomfortable because of a question, that question is usually worth asking. Nadia opened her backpack. Inside was an old leather notebook. The cover had cracked at the corners. Several pages were held together by faded thread. The notebook had traveled with Nadia through every difficult year after her mother died. It had survived moves, shelters, temporary rooms, donated furniture, and nights when Nadia slept with it beneath her pillow because she was afraid someone might take it. To anyone else, it was only a worn book. To Nadia, it was the closest thing she had to hearing her mother's voice again. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with copied symbols, restoration sketches, arrows, questions, and notes written in Elena Reyes's neat, steady handwriting. Some of the pages showed the Saravan charter from different angles. Others contained close studies of the border marks. One page held a rough drawing of a narrow triangular fragment, its edges covered with small symbols. Near the bottom, Elena had written 3 words. "Third fragment missing." Mercer saw the page, and this time his reaction was impossible to miss. His face did not collapse. He did not confess. He did not make the kind of mistake people made in dramatic stories when fear became too large to hide. Instead, he went still. For a man like Mercer, stillness was more revealing than panic. Owen saw it first. Evelyn saw it next. The junior scholars looked from the notebook to Mercer, unsure why a few handwritten words had changed the entire mood of the room. Nadia explained that her mother had always believed the charter was incomplete. The main tablet contained the beginning and central terms of the agreement, but not the final condition. Without that ending, the document could be interpreted in ways that benefited the people holding it. But Elena had believed a third fragment existed, and she had believed it contained the part that mattered most. Mercer dismissed the notebook as private material with no official authority. He said that scattered notes and old sketches could not be treated as evidence. Then he turned toward Owen and instructed him to escort Nadia out of the museum. The command was quiet, direct, and final. It was the kind of order Mercer had given many times before. Most people obeyed him because they knew what happened when they did not. Careers could stall, invitations could disappear, research funding could dry up. A single bad impression from the head of a department could follow a person for years. But Owen did not move. He had spent most of his working life following instructions. Security work taught people to respect procedure. You checked badges, you followed the chain of command, you kept order. You did not insert yourself into conversations that belonged to people with more education, more money, or more authority. But as Owen looked at Nadia holding her mother's notebook, he understood that this was not about procedure. It was about whether someone with less power deserved to be heard. "I think we should verify her claim first," he said. The sentence was simple, but it changed the room. Mercer turned toward him with open irritation. A security guard was not supposed to interrupt an academic dispute. He was supposed to stand near the door and remain invisible. Owen did not look away. Evelyn made the decision before Mercer could respond. She said Nadia would stay. No one would remove her from the building. No documents connected to Elena Reyes would be taken out of the museum. And no final presentation would be given to the Rewritten Council until the old research records had been reviewed. Mercer tried to protest. Evelyn stopped him. She took the notebook from Nadia and studied the sketch of the triangular fragment. The shape appeared to fit along the lower edge of the Rewritten Charter. Elena's handwriting was old, but the detail was precise. This was not the careless scribbling of someone guessing at a mystery. It was the work of a person who had spent long hours looking at something everyone else had ignored. Then another folded page slipped from the notebook. It fell onto the marble floor. Owen bent down and picked it up. The paper had yellowed with age. Most of it had been torn away, leaving only the bottom section intact. But that was enough. At the lower edge was a red administrative note. Further review suspended pending departmental authorization. Below it was a signature, Dr. Julian Mercer. Owen handed the page to Evelyn. She read it once, then again. Mercer said the report had been preliminary. He said Elena had raised questions that could not be proven at the time. He said the department had been under pressure. The evidence had been incomplete, and the suspension had been a normal professional decision. But his explanation did not answer the real question. Why had the review been suspended instead of completed? Why had the final pages gone missing? Why had the museum continued to present the charter as proof of ownership after one of its own researchers raised doubts. And why had Mercer reacted with fear when Nadia mentioned the third fragment? Evelyn looked at the old note in her hand. Then she asked Owen to take Nadia to the archive room beneath the museum. The archive was not part of the public Arden Museum. Visitors saw marble floors, bright galleries, climate-controlled display cases, and carefully chosen labels. The archive was where the less polished history lived. It sat below the galleries behind gray doors and narrow corridors. Metal shelves held old photographs, personnel files, maintenance records, restoration logs, rejected reports, and documents that had not been touched in years. It smelled of dust, paper, cardboard, and cold metal. For Nadia, it felt strangely familiar. Her mother had once worked in rooms like that. Not under gallery lights, not beside wealthy donors. In spaces where people handled broken objects, sorted fragments, and tried to restore what time had damaged. Owen switched on the lights. Rows of shelves stretched ahead of them. At first, Nadia found only small traces of Elena. Her name appeared in old staff rosters, payroll forms, inventory lists, and repair schedules. She was described as a technician, an assistant, a support employee. Never a researcher. Never a contributor. Never someone who had asked questions important enough to threaten the museum's official story. The absence hurt more than Nadia expected. It was one thing to know that her mother had been dismissed. It was another to see how completely her work had been erased. Owen searched through boxes marked with old project names. Nadia moved slowly between cabinets, checking dates and labels. The Saravan Charter had been studied in several phases over the years. The museum had recorded every restoration material, every temperature change, every crack, every photograph. Yet somehow, the final fragment had vanished from the story. Then Nadia found a photograph. It had been taken during an excavation exhibit opening 12 years earlier. Dr. Mercer stood near the center, younger but instantly recognizable, smiling beside donors, visiting scholars, and senior museum officials. Near the edge of the picture, almost cut off by the frame, stood Elena Reyes. She was holding a padded tray. On the tray were several clay fragments. One of them was narrow and triangular. Nadia placed the photograph beside the sketch from her mother's notebook. The shapes matched. The third fragment had existed. It had been found with the charter, and at some point, it had been removed from the official record. Owen searched another shelf and found a large storage box labeled Saravan Restoration Project, 2014 to 2016. Inside were folders of condition reports, photographs, correspondence, and maintenance forms. Several gaps appeared where files should have been. Empty spaces between folders suggested that someone had removed documents long ago. But at the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old storage logs, Owen found an envelope. Elena Reyes's handwriting covered the front. Nadia stared at it for several seconds before touching it. The envelope had survived 12 years in the museum's basement. It had survived staff changes, renovations, storage moves, and whatever effort had been made to erase Elena's work. Somehow, it had remained hidden among files no one thought important enough to destroy. Inside was a partial report. The first page carried Elena's name. The second page described the same border marks Nadia had identified in the lobby. The third page argued that the charter might be a custodial agreement rather than a transfer of ownership. The fourth page mentioned a detached fragment that could contain the final condition of the covenant. And at the bottom, in the same red ink, was the same instruction. Further review suspended. Nadia read the pages again and again. The words were not dramatic. Elena had not written with anger. She had written carefully, professionally, and with the restraint of someone who knew that evidence mattered more than emotion. But between the lines, Nadia could see her mother's loneliness. Elena had been right. She had known something was wrong. She had tried to tell people with the authority to investigate, and someone had made sure the investigation stopped. Nadia thought about the last years of her mother's life. After losing her job at Arden Museum, Elena had taken whatever work she could find. She restored damaged books for a small shop across town. She cleaned offices at night. She repaired old furniture. She translated simple letters and labels for community groups. She never returned to academic conferences. She never received another museum position. She became quieter, more tired, and more careful about what she said. But she never stopped studying. Some nights, Nadia would wake up and see light beneath the kitchen door. Her mother would be sitting at the table with a cup of cold tea, copying symbols into the leather notebook. She had never spoken much about Mercer. She had never explained exactly why she had been forced out. But once, when Nadia was still young, she had asked why her mother kept working on something that had already caused so much pain. Elena had looked up from the page and said, "The truth does not stop being true, just because powerful people are tired of hearing it." Nadia had been too young to understand. Standing in the archive room with the report in her hands, she understood at last. Evelyn arrived a few minutes later. She had been trying to keep the museum from falling apart upstairs. The Saravan Council's cars had already been seen outside. Board members were gathering in the reception hall. The legal team had asked for an update. Donors were beginning to notice that the scheduled presentation had been delayed. But when Evelyn read Elena's report, the urgent noise of the building seemed to fade. She read it once as an administrator looking for liability. Then she read it again as a person trying to understand how an institution had allowed one woman's work to disappear. The report was not reckless. It was not speculative in the careless sense Mercer had claimed. Elena had documented her observations. She had included comparative references. She had outlined what needed to be tested. She had not demanded that the museum surrender the relic immediately. She had simply asked for the truth to be examined. Evelyn looked at Nadia. For the first time that day, Nadia was no longer an unwanted visitor, a shelter girl, or an inconvenience at the worst possible moment. She was the only person in the building carrying evidence everyone else had ignored. A message came through Evelyn's phone. The Saravan Cultural Council had arrived, and somewhere inside Arden Museum, hidden beneath a false label or a forgotten display case, was the missing fragment that could expose everything Julian Mercer had spent 12 years trying to bury. The Saravan Cultural Council entered Arden Museum without anger, spectacle, or raised voices. They did not need any of those things. Their presence alone unsettled the building. The delegation included historians, preservation specialists, legal advisors, and Professor Layla Rahman, one of the most respected scholars of ancient Saravan language and law. They had traveled for years through archives, private collections, old shipping documents, and the scattered records of expeditions that had removed objects from their homeland. For generations, people from Saravan had watched museums around the world display pieces of their culture. Sacred objects had been taken from temples, burial sites, family archives, and ceremonial grounds. They had been transported across oceans, assigned new catalog numbers, placed beneath foreign lighting, and described in languages their creators would never have recognized. The world often called that preservation, but preservation without consent could become another form of theft. The Saravan Council had come to Arden Museum because the charter mattered. It was not only a tablet, it was the legal memory of an agreement made during a time of violence and uncertainty. The relic connected to it had been treated as a trophy by the museum, but to the Saravan people, it was something else entirely. It represented continuity. It represented survival. It represented a promise made by their ancestors that no institution had the right to rewrite. Dr. Mercer greeted the delegation in the reception hall with the calm professionalism that had made him famous. His voice was smooth. His posture was controlled. He intended to lead them into the presentation room, show them the museum's official interpretation, and reassure the board that everything remained under control. But Evelyn interrupted before the briefing could begin. She informed the council that new archival material had been discovered and that the museum could not ethically present a final translation until the evidence had been reviewed. Mercer's frustration appeared only briefly. To most people, he still looked composed. But Layla Rahman noticed. She had spent decades working with scholars, collectors, politicians, and museum leaders. She knew the difference between uncertainty and concealment. She knew when a person was trying to protect truth and when a person was trying to protect a reputation. Then she saw the old leather notebook in Nadia's hands. Layla stopped walking. Her eyes moved to the cracked cover, then to the faint handwriting visible on the open page. For a moment, her expression changed from professional caution to something more personal. "Elena Reyes," she said quietly. I knew her name. Nadia looked up. The room seemed to narrow around those words. Years earlier, before Elena had been forced out of Arden Museum, she had contacted Professor Layla Rahman. Elena had asked questions about the structure of old Saravan custodial agreements. She had sent a short letter describing the border marks on the charter. Layla had replied with several sources and asked for more photographs. Then the correspondence stopped. Layla had never known why. She had assumed Elena had been discouraged. She had assumed the museum had chosen a different direction. She had assumed, as people often assumed when someone disappeared quietly from an institution, that the person must have made a mistake. Now, seeing Nadia, the notebook, and the partial report, Layla understood what had really happened. Elena had been silenced. Nadia showed her the report from the archive, the old photograph, and the sketch of the triangular fragment. Layla examined them carefully. She did not rush to make a grand claim. She asked questions. She compared dates. She looked at the handwriting. She studied the directional markings drawn by Elena beside the tablet. Then she said that the evidence deserved to be taken seriously. That was enough. For the first time, Mercer was no longer controlling the conversation. Nadia remembered another detail from the notebook. The sketch of the missing fragment had been drawn beside a rough outline of the museum's upper gallery. Her mother had written a short sentence beneath it, one Nadia had never fully understood. The final promise was moved where no one would think to read it. Nadia thought of the photograph she had found in the archive. Behind Elena and Mercer, almost hidden by the group of donors, had been a familiar display case. It stood in the upper gallery beside a bronze ceremonial mask. Nadia remembered seeing it years ago when her mother had once brought her to the museum before everything changed. The clue had been there all along. The group moved toward the upper gallery. Mercer tried to stop them without seeming like he was stopping them. He argued that the museum should follow established procedure. He said the council should not be drawn into an internal archival disagreement. He suggested that the search for a missing fragment could take days, perhaps weeks, and that it would be irresponsible to make conclusions before the proper team had examined every record. But his argument only made Evelyn more certain. A man who believed the fragment did not matter would not be trying so hard to delay the search. The upper gallery was quieter than the rest of the museum. Most visitors had been redirected because of the unexpected meeting. Rain darkened the tall windows, turning the city outside into a blurred gray landscape. The bronze ceremonial mask sat behind glass at the center of the room, its surface reflecting faint gold light. Beside it was a small display case containing several fragments that had been labeled as decorative objects of uncertain origin. One of them was triangular. It was smaller than Nadia expected. Smaller than the fear it had caused. Smaller than the years of silence built around it. It rested on dark velvet beneath a short museum label that made it sound meaningless. Decorative clay fragment, origin uncertain. Nadia stood before the glass and felt something cold move through her chest. For 12 years, the truth had been sitting in plain sight. Visitors had walked past it. Scholars had walked past it. Donors had walked past it. Mercer had walked past it every day, knowing exactly what it was. The conservator carefully opened the case. The fragment was removed and placed beside a high-resolution image of the Saravan Charter. The shape aligned with the lower border. The clay composition looked similar. The small directional marks along one edge matched the signs Nadia had identified on the main tablet. Professor Layla leaned closer. Then she looked at Nadia. "It fits," she said. The words carried through the gallery. Mercer immediately tried to dismiss the discovery. He said that fragments could be misleading. He said that similar clay did not establish legal meaning. He said that objects from the same region could resemble each other without belonging together. But Evelyn had already requested the old catalog records. A staff member arrived with digital copies from the museum database. The history of the triangular fragment appeared on the screen. Years earlier, it had been listed as part of the Saravan Restoration Project. Then, 11 years before, its catalog number had been changed. Its link to the charter had been removed. Its classification had been rewritten. Instead of a missing section of a legal tablet, it had become a decorative fragment of uncertain origin. The authorization belonged to Dr. Julian Mercer. This time, no explanation could make the fact disappear. The fragment was taken to the research wing under the supervision of the conservator, Layla, Evelyn, and members of the Saravan Council. The charter was brought from its secure case and placed beneath specialized imaging equipment. Scholars gathered around the monitors. Lawyers stood near the doorway. Board members arrived quietly, their faces pale as they realized the museum's crisis was no longer private. Nadia stood at the edge of the room with her mother's notebook held against her chest. The same people who had ignored her in the lobby were now waiting for the evidence she had led them to reveal itself. At first, the scan showed only dark clay, scratches, and the cloudy residue of an old protective coating. The conservator adjusted the lighting frequency. The image sharpened slowly. A faint line appeared, then another. Then a sequence of symbols emerged beneath the surface, running along the narrow edge of the fragment. The room became completely still. The missing ending had been found. Professor Layla did not translate immediately. She examined the image with care. She compared the symbols to the border marks on the main charter. She followed the Guardian's path Nadia had identified. She corrected the orientation. She checked the grammar against old Saravan legal forms. It was not a miracle. It was evidence finally being allowed to speak. The charter did not describe the sacred relic as something purchased. It did not grant permanent ownership to anyone outside the Saravan community. It described the relic as an entrusted object, placed in the care of guardians during a period of danger. Those guardians had a duty to preserve it. They had a duty to protect it. And when recognized representatives of the Saravan people came forward to request its return, the agreement required the Guardians to give it back. Then Layla reached the final sentence. Her voice softened as she translated the last words. The Guardian who conceals this covenant, alters its meaning, or refuses the rightful return, forfeits all claim to hold what was never theirs. The words settled over the room like a verdict. The Arden Museum had never owned the relic. It had only been trusted with it, and its right to hold it had ended the moment it chose secrecy over truth. No one spoke for several seconds. The members of the Saravan Council stood quietly before the monitor. Their faces carried emotions that did not need explanation. Some looked angry. Some looked exhausted. One older historian closed his eyes, as though he had spent years waiting for the chance to hear those words spoken aloud. For them, the translation was not only a legal victory, it was proof that their ancestors had not been forgotten. The agreement had survived. The language had survived. The truth had survived, even after generations of people tried to bury it beneath labels, glass cases, and institutional certainty. Nadia looked toward Mercer. She remembered how he had looked at her when she first entered the lobby. He had seen a wet jacket, worn shoes, a torn backpack, and a girl from a shelter. He had assumed that was enough information to decide whether she mattered. He had thought he could dismiss her with polished words. He had thought Elena's name had been erased. He had thought the fragment was hidden safely behind a false label. But now the entire room was looking at him. Evelyn stepped forward with Elena's report in her hands. Dr. Mercer, you are suspended pending an independent investigation. Mercer tried to argue that the museum could not make such a decision based on a single translation. He claimed that the council was interpreting incomplete evidence. He insisted that catalog changes could have administrative explanations. He tried to make the truth sound complicated again, because complication had protected him for years. But the evidence was no longer a single translation. It was 12 years of hidden reports. It was altered catalog records. It was a missing fragment reclassified under his authorization. It was Elena's research. It was Nadia's notebook. It was the fear on his face every time someone came too close to what he had done. No one came to defend him. The scholars who had once treated him as untouchable stood in silence. The board members avoided his eyes. The legal team began collecting documents. The Saravan Council watched with the calm dignity of people who had waited too long for the truth to be acknowledged. Mercer's career did not collapse because he lacked intelligence. It collapsed because he believed intelligence gave him the right to decide which truths mattered. He had silenced Elena because she had less power than he did. He had buried her work because it threatened his reputation. He had hidden the fragment because it threatened the museum's claim. And he had dismissed Nadia because he believed a girl from a shelter could never challenge a man with titles, money, and influence. But the truth had returned through the daughter of the woman he tried to erase. The investigation that followed was larger than anyone expected. Arden Museum announced a complete independent review of the Saravan collection. The sacred relic was removed from public display and placed under joint care, while arrangements were made for its return. The museum agreed to work with the Saravan Cultural Council to review every artifact connected to the original expedition. More documents were found in the weeks that followed. There were internal emails showing that Mercer had discouraged staff from revisiting Elena's work. There were catalog revisions with no proper explanation. There were notes from meetings where concerns about ownership had been minimized because donors had invested heavily in the Saravan exhibit. Mercer had not acted alone in every decision, but he had been the person with the power to make silence look official. His suspension became permanent. His academic appointments were reviewed. His published work was questioned. The museum removed his name from several public materials, while the investigation continued. The punishment was not dramatic in the way people expected from stories. There was no public shouting. No one dragged him through the lobby. No one needed to. The truth did something more lasting. It took away the authority he had used to control others. The museum issued a public correction. Elena Reyes's name was restored to the official history of the Saravan Charter. Her report was digitized, preserved, and acknowledged as the first internal research to identify the document as a custodial covenant rather than a transfer of ownership. For years, her work had existed only in a worn notebook and a hidden envelope. Now it became part of the record. A research grant was created in Elena Reyes's name for young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to study history, languages, preservation, archaeology, and cultural heritage. The museum's board did not create the grant because it could erase the past. Nothing could do that. They created it because the future had to become different. Nadia did not become rich overnight. She did not suddenly appear on magazine covers or receive a perfect new life from strangers who had ignored her before. That would not have been honest. Her problems did not disappear because one day changed everything. But the day did change the direction of her life. She received a paid internship with the joint Saravan Arden Preservation Project. The position came with transportation support, educational guidance, and stable housing assistance through a youth transition program. For the first time in a long time, Nadia had a place to go that did not feel temporary. She also had a future that did not depend on someone else deciding she belonged. Professor Layla became one of her mentors. She did not treat Nadia as a miracle or a symbol. She treated her as a young person with knowledge, patience, and a deep connection to the work her mother had begun. She taught Nadia how to verify evidence, how to question assumptions, and how to let facts speak louder than anger. Nadia listened carefully, but she never forgot the lesson she had already learned from Elena. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is refuse to let the truth become invisible. Months later, Nadia returned to the archive room beneath Arden Museum. The room still smelled of dust, paper, and old metal shelves, but it no longer felt like a place where forgotten stories were buried. A new workstation had been set up near the window. There were digitization tools, preservation folders, and neatly labeled boxes waiting to be cataloged. Nadia entered with her own identification badge. This time, she did not come through the side door hoping someone would let her stay. She belonged there. On her desk sat her mother's old leather notebook beside a new archival folder. The label read, Elena Reyes Collection. Nadia opened the notebook to the first page. There, in faded handwriting, was a sentence her mother had written years before. The truth is often hidden in the part everyone else ignores. For years, Nadia had thought those words were only about old symbols and forgotten documents. Now she understood that they were about people too. They were about the quiet worker no one bothered to credit. They were about the poor girl no one thought was worth listening to. They were about the community whose history had been carried away and renamed by strangers. They were about the small fragment everyone walked past because they had already decided it could not matter. The world often judges people by clothes, titles, money, addresses, and appearances. But wisdom does not always arrive wearing the shape people expect. Sometimes it comes carrying a torn backpack. Sometimes it stands quietly in the rain. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the one carrying the truth that changes everything. After a long day of airports and travel, Marcus wanted only one quiet room where his exhausted little daughter could finally rest.
Dad, are we finally home for tonight?
Before Marcus had even finished speaking, Derek looked at his clothes and decided that he did not belong there.
I'm sorry, sir. We have no rooms available.
Marcus did not argue. He simply watched Derek's polite expression turn cold when he realized Marcus looked like an ordinary traveler.
Could you please check once more? My daughter is exhausted.
Only moments later, a wealthy-looking couple arrived.
Welcome. We have a beautiful room ready for you.
And suddenly, Derek had a room ready without hesitation. That small movement told Marcus everything. There had been rooms all along. The lie had been about appearance.
So the rooms were never the problem.
Maya could see the truth on the reservation screen. Rooms were open, but fear kept her silent.
There are rooms, I know there are.
Marcus knew children could feel humiliation long before they understood the word for it.
Their choices say nothing about who we are.
Marcus did not raise his voice. He asked only to speak with the manager and have the system checked honestly.
Then let me speak with your manager.
Derek brought Richard from the back office, and Richard arrived already convinced that Marcus was the problem.
I'm told you are causing a disturbance.
Richard did not ask what happened or check the system. He looked at Marcus and decided he did not belong.
This hotel maintains standards, sir. Escort them outside before this becomes more serious.
Richard called security and ordered Marcus and Zoe removed, turning a simple request for honesty into public humiliation. For several seconds, he said nothing. He stood beneath the soft gold lights of the lobby, while Zoe leaned against him, her small body heavy with exhaustion. The polished marble floor reflected the chandelier overhead. Somewhere near the lounge, a pianist played a slow, elegant melody. Guests drifted through the lobby with designer luggage, expensive watches, and the relaxed confidence of people who had never needed to wonder whether a door would be opened for them. And in the middle of all that comfort, Marcus and his daughter had been made to feel like an inconvenience. Derek had already turned his attention back to the couple who had arrived after them. His voice changed the moment he spoke to them. It became warmer, brighter, polished in a way it had never been when he spoke to Marcus. He welcomed them with the kind of smile that belonged in brochures and advertisements. He asked about their trip. He complimented their luggage. He spoke about the hotel's amenities, as though he were personally proud of every polished surface in the building. Then, without even checking twice, he assigned them a room. Marcus watched the key card slide across the counter. That small movement told him everything. There had been rooms. There had always been rooms. The lie had never been about availability. It had been about appearance. Zoe lifted her face from Marcus's side and looked toward the desk. She was too tired to be fully upset, but she was old enough to sense when adults were being unfair. Her eyes followed Derek as he gave the other guests directions toward the elevator. Marcus looked down at her and gently adjusted the strap of her backpack. He had promised her a warm shower, room service, and a bed with too many pillows. Before their flight, he had told her that they would make a little adventure out of the night, even though they both knew they were tired. Zoe had smiled at that idea. She had spent most of the flight curled against him, holding the small stuffed rabbit she brought everywhere. Now, her excitement had disappeared. Marcus had learned long ago that children could feel humiliation before they knew the word for it. They could hear it in the tone adults used. They could see it in the way people looked away. They could sense it in the sudden stiffness of a room when someone decided they did not belong. Marcus had seen that truth in his own childhood. His father had worked as a night security guard for nearly 30 years. Not in one grand hotel, but in several. He had worked in office buildings, private clubs, luxury apartment towers, and restaurants where the customers spent in one evening what he earned in a month. He wore a uniform every night, stood near entrances for hours, opened doors for people who rarely looked at him, and walked empty hallways. long after the city had gone quiet. Marcus remembered waiting up for him as a boy. He remembered the sound of his father's keys at the door after midnight. He remembered the tired way his father took off his shoes in the kitchen, trying not to wake anyone. He remembered the faint smell of rain, coffee, and the cold night air clinging to his coat. Most of all, he remembered how his father never complained. But children notice more than adults think. Marcus had heard enough fragments of conversation to understand that his father was treated differently by some people. He had heard about guests who snapped their fingers instead of saying hello. Managers who spoke to him as though he were invisible. People who assumed he was uneducated because he wore a uniform. People who called him only when they needed help, then looked through him the moment the problem was solved. His father had always told him that work had dignity, no matter what title came with it. But Marcus had also seen the sadness in his father's face on the nights when dignity was the only thing anyone had left him. That was why Marcus never forgot the feeling of being judged before being known. It was why he built his company with a different kind of promise. Years later, when Marcus had begun buying struggling hotels and turning them around, people had assumed his greatest advantage was his business instinct. They saw the growth, the renovations, the partnerships, the expansion into new cities. They saw a successful entrepreneur with a sharp eye for numbers and an even sharper eye for opportunity. What they did not always understand was that Marcus had never wanted to build hotels merely to create wealth. He wanted to create places where people felt human. He wanted every guest to feel welcome, whether they arrived in a suit or a sweatshirt, whether they had booked the penthouse or the smallest available room, whether they were famous, wealthy, tired, grieving, alone, or simply trying to make it through the night. He had built that principle into the company from the beginning. Respect before revenue, care before appearances, hospitality without judgment. Those were not slogans to Marcus. They were personal. And yet, standing in that lobby with Zoe half asleep beside him, he could feel those values slipping through the hands of people who had never understood them. Marcus finally looked at Derek again. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand attention. He simply asked whether Derek would be willing to check the system one more time. It was a reasonable request. A tired father asking for a room for his child. Nothing more. But Derek's smile faded. The warmth he had shown the wealthy couple vanished, as though someone had switched off a light. He stared at Marcus with the irritation of a man who believed he had already ended the conversation and should not have to repeat himself. He insisted that the hotel was fully booked. Then he added that Marcus might have better luck, somewhere more suitable. The words were carefully chosen. Derek did not say exactly what he meant. He did not need to. The insult lived in the pause before the final word. It lived in the look he gave Marcus's hoodie. It lived in the quick glance toward Zoe, as though the presence of a tired child made them even more out of place. Some of the nearby guests heard it. A woman seated near the lounge lowered her magazine and looked toward the desk. A man waiting beside the elevators glanced over his shoulder. The bell attendant near the entrance shifted slightly, uncertain whether he should pretend not to notice. Behind the desk, Maya stood very still. She had been watching from the beginning. Maya had worked at the hotel for almost 2 years. She was good at her job. She remembered guest preferences, kept track of small details, and treated nervous travelers with patience. She was the kind of employee who noticed when someone needed help before they asked for it. But she had also learned something during those 2 years. The hotel had rules on paper, and then it had unspoken rules in practice. Richard, the evening manager, had his favorites. Derek was one of them. Derek had been there longer. He knew how to flatter important guests. He knew how to make wealthy customers feel seen. He had a polished manner that management often mistook for excellence. But Maya had seen another side of him. She had watched him become impatient with guests who spoke with accents. She had seen him dismiss people who looked nervous about money. She had heard him make jokes in the break room about people who did not fit the image he believed the hotel should project. Maya had never agreed with him, but she had never openly challenged him either. She had told herself that she was trying to keep her job. She had told herself that speaking up would only make things worse. She had told herself that someone with more authority would eventually notice. But as she looked at Zoe, tired and confused beside her father, those excuses began to feel smaller. Maya could see the reservation screen from where she stood. She knew exactly how many rooms were available. There were 12 standard rooms still open, 4 junior suites, 2 family suites, and 1 corner suite on the 18th floor that had been held back for late arrivals. She could have said something. One sentence would have been enough. But fear had a way of making silence feel safer than truth. Marcus noticed her hesitation. He saw the way her eyes moved from the screen to Derek, then from Derek to Zoe. He saw the guilt settle into her face. He did not know her name yet, but he understood what he was seeing. Maya was not cruel. She was afraid. And fear, Marcus knew, could make good people stand still while something wrong unfolded in front of them. He turned his attention back to Derek. There was no anger in his voice when he asked whether he could speak with the manager. That request changed the atmosphere immediately. Derek's posture stiffened. For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered across his face. It lasted only a moment, but Marcus saw it. Derek knew that a manager could check the system. A manager could see that rooms were available. A manager could ask why a guest had been turned away while others were welcomed. But Derek also knew something else. Richard trusted him, and Richard had his own ideas about who belonged in the hotel. Derek disappeared through the door behind the desk. As he went, Maya kept her eyes on Marcus. She looked as though she wanted to apologize, but no words came. Zoe tugged gently at Marcus's sleeve. Her voice was quiet. She asked why the man at the desk did not want to help them. Marcus looked down at her, and for the first time that night, a little pain moved across his face. Not because Derek had insulted him. Marcus could handle that. He had spent his life learning how to survive other people's assumptions. What hurt was that Zoe had been pulled into it. She was young enough to believe hotels were places where people smiled at you, gave you little soaps, and told you where the elevators were. She had not yet learned that some adults treated kindness like a privilege instead of a responsibility. Marcus did not want that lesson to reach her tonight. So he told her, gently, that sometimes people made decisions before they knew the full story. He told her that it did not mean they were right. He told her that the way someone treated you said more about their character than it did about yours. Zoe listened quietly. Then she rested her head against him again. That simple gesture made the woman near the lounge look away for a moment. She suddenly seemed embarrassed to be watching. The businessman near the elevator checked his phone, but not because he had received a message. He was avoiding the discomfort in the air. The lobby had become a place where everyone could see the unfairness, but no one yet knew what to do about it. A few minutes later, Richard came through the back office door. He moved with the confidence of a man who had spent too long being obeyed. His suit was perfectly tailored. His tie was straight. His shoes were polished enough to reflect the lobby lights. He looked less like someone arriving to solve a problem and more like someone arriving to shut one down. Derek walked beside him, speaking in a low voice. Marcus could not hear every word, but he did not need to. Derek's body language told the story. He leaned toward Richard. He gestured toward Marcus. He shook his head as though he were describing an unreasonable guest, a disruptive guest, a difficult guest. By the time Richard reached the front desk, he had already chosen a side. He did not begin by asking Marcus what happened. He did not ask to see the reservation system. He did not ask Maya whether there were rooms available. He did not ask why another couple had been checked in moments after Marcus was told the hotel was full. Instead, he looked Marcus up and down. It was a brief glance, but it carried years of judgment. Marcus had seen that glance in boardrooms before people knew his name. He had seen it in restaurants when hosts assumed he was waiting for someone else. He had seen it in private meetings when executives assumed the older white man beside him was the real decision maker. Richard looked at Marcus the same way. Not as a guest, not as a father, not as a person who might deserve the benefit of the doubt, but as a problem. Richard asked what the issue was. Marcus explained calmly. He said he had asked for a room for himself and his daughter. He said Derek had told him there were none available. He said another couple had arrived after them and had been given a room immediately. He asked only that someone check the system honestly. His voice remained controlled. That made Richard even more dismissive. Richard listened with the shallow patience of someone pretending to be fair. Then he turned to Derek, who repeated the lie with more confidence now that his manager was standing beside him. Derek claimed that the rooms had been reserved for priority guests. Marcus asked what priority meant. Richard answered that certain reservations and memberships received special consideration. It was not a complete lie. Luxury hotels did have systems for priority guests, but it was not the truth either. The rooms Derek had assigned were not reserved for anyone. The couple had simply walked in. No special membership had been checked. No priority status had been confirmed. Richard was using policy as a shield, and Marcus recognized it immediately. Policies were supposed to guide people toward fairness, but in the wrong hands they became excuses for cruelty. Marcus asked Richard to show him the policy. Richard's expression hardened. The request was still calm, still reasonable, but Richard heard it as a challenge. He told Marcus that guests did not get to demand internal documents. He suggested that Marcus was misunderstanding how luxury hospitality worked. He said the hotel maintained certain standards and that the staff had the right to make decisions that protected the experience of its guests. The words were polished. The meaning was ugly. Marcus looked around the lobby. He noticed the guests listening now. He noticed Maya's hands trembling slightly near the keyboard. He noticed the security guard standing near the entrance, who had been quietly summoned by Derek while Richard spoke. The guard was a broad-shouldered man named Daniel. He had worked in security for years. Unlike Derek and Richard, he did not appear smug or pleased by the situation. He looked uncomfortable. His eyes moved from Marcus to Zoe, then back to Richard. Daniel had seen difficult guests before. He had dealt with yelling, threats, intoxicated visitors, stolen luggage, and arguments that got out of control. But Marcus was not shouting. He was not threatening anyone. He was standing quietly beside an exhausted little girl and asking why the truth could not be checked. Daniel knew the difference between a problem and a person being treated like one. Still, Richard had authority, and authority had a way of making decent people question their own instincts. Richard's voice grew colder. He told Marcus that the hotel was not able to accommodate him, and that it would be best for him to leave before the matter became more complicated. Marcus asked one final question. He asked Richard whether he was refusing him because there were truly no rooms available, or because Richard had decided Marcus did not look like the kind of guest the hotel wanted. For the first time, Richard looked genuinely irritated. His face tightened. His eyes shifted toward the other guests. He did not want to answer directly, because the truth would sound terrible out loud. So instead, he accused Marcus of trying to create a scene. That was the tactic. When people could not defend what they had done, they often changed the subject. They turned the victim's calm questions into aggression. They called truth inconvenient. They called dignity difficult. They hoped that embarrassment would force the other person to leave before anyone had to confront the real issue. Richard told Daniel to escort Marcus and Zoe outside. The words landed heavily in the lobby. Zoe looked up at her father again. This time, she did not ask why they could not have a room. She asked why the hotel workers were trying to make them leave when helping people was supposed to be their job. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the lobby more sharply than any shout could have. For a moment, no one moved. Derek looked away. Maya closed her eyes briefly, as though she could no longer bear to watch. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped. Richard's jaw tightened. The woman near the lounge placed her magazine on the table. The businessman by the elevator no longer pretended not to be listening. Even the couple Derek had just checked in looked uncomfortable now. They had come in expecting a quiet night at a luxury hotel. Instead, they were watching a tired father and child being treated as though they had done something wrong simply by walking through the door. Marcus felt Zoe's hand slip into his. He held it carefully. Then he looked at Daniel. Marcus did not blame him. He could see that Daniel was not enjoying this. He could see the conflict in his face. Daniel was being told to follow orders, and Marcus understood that jobs could make people feel trapped. So Marcus spoke to him with respect. He told Daniel that he wasn't there to cause trouble. He said he would not resist. He only wanted the hotel to be honest about why it was trying to remove him and his daughter. Daniel nodded slightly. It was the smallest gesture, but it mattered. Because in that moment, Daniel was no longer looking at Marcus through Richard's eyes. He was seeing him clearly. And once a person began to see clearly, it became harder to keep pretending nothing was wrong. Richard, however, had already gone too far to step back gracefully. He told Marcus that if he refused to leave, the situation could become more serious. The threat was unnecessary. That was what made it so revealing. Marcus had not raised his voice. He had not insulted anyone. He had not even stepped away from the desk. But Richard wanted the power of making him feel small. He wanted Marcus to understand that he could be removed, dismissed, and humiliated without anyone caring. What Richard did not understand was that Marcus had spent a lifetime learning that dignity did not come from other people's approval. of the lobby, the elevator doors opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out quickly. His name was Thomas Webb. He was the chief executive officer of the entire hotel group, and he was walking toward Marcus with an expression that made Derek, Richard, and Maya realize that the man in the gray hoodie was not who they thought he was. Not even close. Thomas Webb did not slow down as he crossed the lobby. The moment he saw Marcus standing beside Zoe, his entire expression changed. The urgency in his face was obvious, but what stunned everyone watching was the respect behind it. Thomas was not approaching Marcus like a manager coming to calm down an upset guest. He was approaching him like someone who had just realized that a serious failure had taken place under the roof of the man who owned the entire company. Derek noticed it first. The confidence that had carried him through the evening disappeared almost instantly. His fingers stopped moving across the desk. His shoulders stiffened. He looked from Thomas to Marcus, then back to Thomas again, as though his mind could not make sense of what he was seeing. Richard's reaction was slower, but even more painful to watch. For several long seconds, he stood perfectly still. He had been so certain of himself moments earlier. He had believed the hotel belonged to people who looked polished, wealthy, and important. He had believed his title gave him the power to decide who deserved patience and who deserved humiliation. But now the chief executive officer of the entire hotel group was walking straight past him, not toward Derek, not toward the front desk, toward Marcus. Thomas reached Marcus and immediately apologized. He did not apologize in the vague, polished language managers often used when they wanted a problem to disappear. He apologized with the seriousness of a man who understood the damage had already been done. He said that he had come as quickly as he could. He said he had received Marcus's message and understood that something deeply wrong had happened. Then, in front of every guest, every employee, and every person who had watched the situation unfold, Thomas addressed Marcus with the title no one in that lobby had expected to hear. "Mr. Johnson." The silence became absolute. Maya's eyes widened. Daniel, the security guard, looked at Marcus again, but this time with a completely different understanding. The exhausted father in the gray hoodie was not simply a guest who had been treated unfairly. He was Marcus Johnson, the founder and owner of the hotel group. The man whose name appeared in annual reports, corporate training materials, investor conferences, and internal company messages. The man who had built the very hotel where Richard had tried to throw him out. Derek's face lost its color. Richard looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. But Marcus did not look triumphant. That was what made the moment even heavier. He did not smile. He did not step forward to embarrass them. He did not enjoy the fear in their faces. Instead, he looked down at Zoe, whose hand was still wrapped around his, then back at Thomas. Marcus told him that he had come to the hotel after a long flight with his daughter. He had asked for one room. He had been told there were none available. Then he had watched another couple receive a room only moments later. He explained that when he asked for clarification, he had been treated as a problem. When he asked for a manager, he had been judged before anyone checked the facts. And when he refused to accept a lie, he and his tired child had been threatened with removal from the building. Thomas listened without interrupting. His expression grew harder with every sentence. Marcus did not exaggerate. He did not need to. The truth was already standing in front of everyone. The reservation system was behind the desk. Maya had seen the available rooms. Daniel had heard Richard's order. The guests nearby had witnessed Derek's sudden change in attitude when the well-dressed couple entered. There was no confusion left, only accountability. Thomas turned to Richard first. He asked whether Marcus's account was accurate. Richard opened his mouth, but for the first time that night, he had no polished explanation ready. He tried to say that there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed that Derek had been following procedure. He suggested that the situation had become difficult because Marcus had challenged the staff in front of other guests. But even as he spoke, the weakness of his words became obvious. He had not checked the system. He had not asked Maya what she saw. He had not investigated the available rooms. He had not shown concern for Zoe. He had only looked at Marcus and decided that someone dressed like him did not deserve the same respect as someone dressed in expensive clothes. Thomas asked Richard a simple question. He asked whether the hotel's standards included judging guests by their appearance. Richard could not answer, because there was only one honest answer, and everyone knew it. Then Thomas turned to Derek. Derek tried to defend himself by claiming he had assumed the rooms needed to be held for preferred guests. He said he had been trying to protect the hotel's reputation. He said that he had not intended to insult Marcus or Zoe. But Marcus looked at him with a calm disappointment that was more powerful than anger. He told Derek that the problem was not whether Derek knew his identity. The problem was that Derek had believed it was acceptable to lie to a father and child because he thought they had no power. Marcus explained that respect was not something guests earned by wearing the right clothes. It was not a reward for wealth, status, or influence. It was the minimum every person deserved before anyone knew their name. Derek lowered his eyes. He had no answer for that either. Thomas asked Maya to step forward. At first, she looked frightened. She had spent the entire evening trapped between what she knew was right and what she feared might happen if she spoke. Her hands were shaking slightly as she came around the desk. She looked at Marcus, then at Thomas, then at Richard. Thomas asked her whether rooms had been available. Maya hesitated. For one painful second, it seemed as though fear might win again. Then she looked at Zoe. The little girl was still tired, still quiet, still holding her father's hand. But there was something about seeing Zoe there that finally broke through Maya's silence. She told the truth. She said there had been rooms available from the beginning. She said Derek knew it. She said she had seen open rooms in the system. She admitted that she had been afraid to challenge him because Richard always took Derek's side. She admitted that she should have spoken sooner. Her voice trembled as she said it. But once the truth started, it did not stop. Maya explained that this was not the first time Derek had judged guests based on appearance. She had seen him speak differently to people who seemed wealthy and important. She had seen him dismiss guests who looked uncertain, tired, or out of place. She had kept quiet because she had believed that speaking up would cost her the job she needed. Richard looked at her with disbelief, not because he was shocked by what Derek had done, but because he was shocked that Maya had finally found the courage to say it. Thomas listened carefully. Then he asked Daniel what he had witnessed. The security guard looked toward Richard, then toward Marcus. Daniel did not rush his answer. He was clearly uncomfortable being placed in the middle of the situation. But he spoke honestly. He said Marcus had never been aggressive. He said Zoe had been visibly exhausted. He said Richard had ordered him to escort them out, despite the fact that Marcus had only asked for a truthful explanation. Daniel admitted that he had known something felt wrong. He said he should have questioned the order sooner. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood what it meant for Daniel to say that in front of his manager. It took courage to admit when fear had almost made you part of an injustice. Thomas looked around the lobby. By then, no one was pretending not to watch. The woman near the lounge had stood up. The businessman by the elevator had moved closer. Even the couple who had been checked in ahead of Marcus looked ashamed. They had not asked for special treatment, but they had benefited from it without realizing someone else had been denied. Thomas addressed the entire room. He said that this hotel had not failed because a guest complained. It had failed because employees had forgotten the purpose of hospitality. The building was beautiful. The rooms were expensive. The service was supposed to be exceptional. But none of that mattered if a tired father and his child could walk through the front doors and be treated as though they were less worthy than everyone else. Then he looked directly at Derek. Thomas informed him that he was being terminated immediately. Derek stared at him. The words seemed to take a moment to sink in. He had believed the front desk gave him power. He had believed he could decide who deserved warmth and who deserved rejection. He had used a lie about room availability to make someone feel small. And now, in the same lobby where he had tried to deny Marcus a place to stay, he was losing the job that had made him feel important. But Derek's termination was not simply because he had insulted the owner. Marcus made that clear. Derek was being fired because he had lied to a guest, because he had judged people by appearance, because he had used the hotel's name to make cruelty look like policy, and because he had forgotten that hospitality was not a costume you wore for wealthy people. It was a responsibility. Derek tried to speak. He tried to explain that he had not known who Marcus was. Marcus stopped him gently. He told Derek that knowing would have changed nothing. That was the point. Derek should have treated Marcus with dignity, even if he had been an unknown traveler with no money, no title, and no influence. He should have treated Zoe with kindness because she was a tired child, not because she happened to be the daughter of the hotel owner. The truth settled over the lobby like a weight. Then Thomas turned toward Richard. Richard had been quiet for several minutes. His face had become stiff and pale. He seemed to understand that his position was no longer safe, but he still tried to hold on to the authority that had failed him. He said he had been following the information given to him. He said he had trusted his senior employee. He said he had been trying to protect the hotel from disruption. Marcus listened without expression. Then he reminded Richard that leadership was not about blindly protecting the people beneath you. Leadership was about asking questions when something did not feel right. It was about defending fairness even when it was inconvenient. It was about protecting guests, employees, and the values of the organization. Richard had not done any of those things. He had not checked the facts. He had not listened to Marcus. He had not noticed Zoe. He had used his position to make another human being feel powerless. And when he saw a man in a hoodie asking for fairness, he had decided that humiliation was easier than investigation. Thomas informed Richard that he was also being terminated, effective immediately. The difference between Derek and Richard was important. Derek had started the lie, but Richard had made it dangerous. He had taken a moment of prejudice and turned it into public humiliation. He had taken a tired father's request for a room and treated it like a threat. He had ordered security to remove a child from the hotel rather than admit that his employee might be wrong. That was why the consequences had to be serious. Richard's title had not protected him. His suit had not protected him. His confidence had not protected him. Because in the end, the power he thought he had was never meant to make others feel small. It was meant to make them feel safe. Marcus stood quietly as Derek and Richard were asked to leave the front desk area. Neither man received the scene they might have expected. No shouting, no dramatic revenge, no cruel words thrown back at them. Marcus did not need to humiliate them. Their own choices had already done that. The same people they had judged by appearances had watched them reveal their true character. The same lobby where they had tried to push Marcus out had become the place where everyone saw that their authority had been hollow all along. After they left, the lobby remained silent. Then Marcus turned to Maya. She looked terrified that she would be next. She admitted again that she should have spoken up earlier. She said she had known the rooms were available. She said she had seen the injustice, but had been afraid of Richard. She did not try to excuse herself. She did not pretend she had done enough. Marcus studied her for a moment. He understood that silence could cause harm. But he also understood that courage was not always loud at first. Sometimes it arrived late, trembling and uncertain, but still honest. Marcus told Maya that she had made a mistake by staying quiet. But he also told her that she had chosen truth when it mattered most. He said the company did not need employees who were afraid to protect what was right. It needed people who could learn from fear and become stronger because of it. Thomas nodded. Then Marcus asked Maya whether she was willing to help rebuild the culture at the hotel. Maya looked confused. Marcus explained that she would not be punished for telling the truth. Instead, she would be given an opportunity. She would be assigned to work directly with the hotel's guest experience and staff training team. Her role would be to help ensure that every employee understood what had gone wrong that night and why it could never happen again. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She had expected to lose everything. Instead, she had been given a chance to help create something better. Marcus then turned to Daniel. The security guard stood quietly near the entrance, still looking uncomfortable about how close he had come to escorting Marcus and Zoe outside. Marcus thanked him for stopping before the situation went further. He told Daniel that following orders was sometimes necessary, but it should never mean abandoning conscience. He said that a security guard's job was not only to protect property, it was to protect people. Daniel nodded, visibly moved. Marcus told Thomas that Daniel should remain in his position and be included in the next round of training. Not as punishment, but as a reminder that every employee, no matter their role, had the power to stop harm when they saw it. Only then did Marcus look down at Zoe. The entire time, she had remained close to him. She had watched the adults change their voices. She had seen the people who were cold to them suddenly become nervous. She had seen her father remain calm, while everyone around him seemed to lose control. Marcus bent slightly and asked her if she was still tired. Zoe nodded. Then, with the honesty only a child could offer, she asked whether they could finally go to their room. The lobby softened. A few people smiled through the tension. Thomas immediately stepped forward and offered to personally take them to the best available suite. But Marcus shook his head gently. He did not want the best room, because everyone now knew who he was. He wanted the room they should have been offered from the beginning. A clean, comfortable room for a father and daughter who had arrived tired after a long flight. Nothing more, and nothing less. Thomas understood. He asked Maya to prepare one of the family suites and make sure Zoe had everything she needed. Maya moved quickly, but this time her energy came from purpose rather than fear. She checked the reservation system herself. She selected a quiet room away from the elevators. She arranged for warm food, extra blankets, a child-sized robe, and a small basket of snacks. When she handed Marcus the key cards, her hands were steadier. She apologized again. Marcus accepted the apology, but he reminded her that the best apology was not what she said tonight. It was what she chose to do tomorrow. That night, Marcus and Zoe finally rode the elevator upstairs. As the doors closed, Zoe leaned against him and asked whether the hotel workers knew who he was now. Marcus looked at the numbers rising above the elevator doors. Then he told her that what mattered was not whether people knew who he was. What mattered was whether they learned to treat everyone kindly before they knew. 3 months later, The hotel looked the same from the outside. The marble still gleamed. The chandeliers still hung above the lobby. The piano still played near the lounge. But inside, something had changed. Maya had become part of a new training program created across the entire hotel group. She was no longer just a receptionist trying to survive a difficult workplace. She had become a leader in guest experience, helping employees understand that hospitality was not about recognizing wealthy faces. It was about seeing human beings. The training sessions did not begin with numbers, sales goals, or luxury standards. They began with one question: how would you treat this person if you believed they had nothing to offer you? That question changed everything. Employees were taught to notice the tired parent, the nervous traveler, the older couple counting money carefully before checking in, the guest whose clothes did not match the hotel's expensive image, and the person who looked like they had nowhere else to go. They were taught that dignity should never depend on appearance. Daniel remained in security. He became known for his calm, respectful way of handling tense situations. He never forgot the night he almost followed an order he knew was wrong. And because he remembered it, he became more willing to speak up when something did not feel right. One rainy evening, 3 months after Marcus and Zoe had been denied a room, a family walked into the lobby. The father wore a faded jacket. The mother carried a sleeping toddler. Their luggage was old, and their shoes were wet from the rain. They looked exhausted. They looked uncertain. They looked like the kind of people Derek and Richard might once have dismissed before even hearing their names. But Maya saw them immediately. She stepped out from behind the desk before they had to ask for help. She welcomed them warmly. She asked whether they had traveled far. She noticed the child asleep against the mother's shoulder and offered them a quiet room away from the elevator. She did not look at their clothes. She did not look at their luggage. She did not make them prove that they belonged. She simply treated them as people who needed kindness. From the far side of the lobby, Marcus watched quietly. He had stopped by the hotel again without an announcement. This time, Zoe was with him too, holding her stuffed rabbit and looking much more awake than she had been 3 months earlier. She watched Maya help the family. Then she looked up at her father and smiled. Marcus smiled back. For the first time since that painful night, he felt that the hotel was beginning to become what he had always hoped it would be. Not perfect, but better. Because the real measure of a place was never the height of its ceilings, the shine of its floors, or the cost of its rooms. It was the way people were treated when no one believed they were important. Marcus had not won because he was the owner. He had won because he refused to let another person's prejudice take away his dignity. And Derek and Richard had not lost their jobs simply because they insulted a powerful man. They lost their jobs because they had forgotten something far more important. They had forgotten that every person deserves respect before they are asked to prove who they are. Because real character is not revealed by how we treat people who can reward us. It is revealed by how we treat the people we think cannot. And sometimes, the person standing quietly in front of you is not just a stranger. Sometimes, they are the moment that reveals who you truly are. If you believe kindness should never depend on status, share this story and tell us in the comments. Would you have spoken up if you had been standing in that lobby?
That woman does not belong in this hearing.
Everyone watched the wrong woman. Leonard noticed the box.
How is that box here?
Naomi stayed perfectly still.
I did not come here for myself.
A red seal waited.
Please let the record speak.
And the moment Leonard saw that red seal, his practiced calm disappeared.
That seal was never supposed to surface.
Arthur sat trapped in silence.
I am still here.
His mind was still awake.
I understand what is happening.
Leonard controlled every word.
He cannot manage these decisions anymore.
He turned illness into weakness.
My uncle needs someone to protect him.
He called Naomi dangerous.
She is using his condition to get close to his money.
He still has the right to be heard.
She came to restore his voice.
The seal will be examined.
And its secret began 3 days earlier. The seal mattered because Arthur had tried to tell Naomi about it 3 days before the hearing, when everyone around him had already decided that his broken speech meant a broken mind. He was sitting in a rehabilitation room at St. Agnes Medical Center, his right hand resting weakly against a laminated communication board. The board contained simple pictures meant to help him choose water, food, pain medicine, rest, and family. Leonard had approved it because it made Arthur look helpless. It reduced a man who had built one of the largest manufacturing companies in the state to a row of small drawings that other people could interpret for him. But Arthur did not point to water. He did not point to home. He did not point to Leonard, even though Leonard had been standing nearby with the patient patience of a man performing concern for an audience. Arthur kept pressing one unremarkable image near the bottom of the board, a small brass lantern. The nurses assumed he wanted the bedside light adjusted. Leonard assumed he was confused. Naomi understood that Arthur was trying to reach a place that had been designed for exactly this moment. For nearly 40 years, Wren Meridian Industries had been known as Arthur Wren's company. It had begun with a single machine shop on the eastern edge of the city and grown into a national manufacturer of building systems, public transit equipment, and low-cost modular housing. Arthur had become wealthy, but the company's most important story was never its market value. Its story was the people who had stayed when business was difficult. Welders, machinists, warehouse workers, clerks, maintenance crews, and families who could trace 3 generations of steady work back to the same factory gates. Arthur liked to say that a company was not a monument to the person who founded it. It was a promise made to the people whose hands kept it standing. He had put that belief into practice in ways that irritated investors and inspired employees. Wren Meridian maintained a housing division that built durable apartments for working families. It funded scholarships for trade students. It kept a medical assistance program for retired employees long after accountants argued that the expense no longer made business sense. Those choices were not sentimental accidents. Arthur had seen what happened when executives treated workers as numbers in a report. His own father had lost a job during a factory consolidation when Arthur was young, and the memory had stayed with him. Success, he believed, meant little if it required people who had given their lives to a business to become disposable the moment they became inconvenient. Leonard Hale had never shared that belief. He was Arthur's sister's son, and from the beginning, he had learned how to make ambition look like devotion. Leonard had joined the company 15 years earlier, after an impressive career in consulting. He understood market language, shareholder pressure, acquisition strategy, and the polished way successful people could turn a selfish proposal into a speech about the future. He could make a layoff sound like a rescue plan. He could make the sale of a neighborhood look like innovation. He could sit beside a worried employee, lower his voice, touch their shoulder, and leave them feeling that they had been heard, even while he prepared to do the opposite of what they needed. Arthur had noticed Leonard's talent long before he recognized the danger beneath it. He made his nephew chief operating officer because the company was changing and because he believed younger leadership needed room to grow. Leonard rewarded that trust by becoming indispensable. He learned every division, befriended board members, cultivated bankers, and placed loyal executives in positions where they could control the flow of information. By the time Arthur began asking difficult questions about certain transactions, Leonard had already built a circle around himself. The conflict between them had started quietly. Leonard wanted to sell Ren Meridian's housing division to a private investment group called Horizon Vale Partners. The sale would be described as a strategic restructuring. Investors would receive a large immediate return. Ren Meridian would become leaner, more profitable, and easier to reposition for a future public offering. Leonard spoke about the proposal as though it were the only rational answer to a changing economy. Arthur saw something else. He saw rents rising, workers being pushed farther from their jobs, and an entire mission being handed to people who had never cared about it. He knew Horizon Vale had a record of buying affordable properties, cutting maintenance, raising fees, and selling them again when the numbers improved. He also knew that once the division was gone, it would never return. For 2 years, Arthur refused to approve the sale. He delayed meetings, requested independent reviews, and kept his voting shares locked behind a trust structure that made a quick takeover difficult. Leonard smiled through every disagreement. In public, he praised his uncle's wisdom. In private, he began preparing for the day Arthur could no longer stand in his way. That day appeared to arrive on a cold Sunday morning in early March, when Arthur suffered a stroke. The stroke did not take his memory. It did not erase his judgment. It damaged the part of his brain that helped turn thoughts into spoken language. The doctors explained that he had aphasia, a condition that could make it painfully difficult to find words, form sentences, read quickly, or answer questions under pressure. To anyone willing to slow down, use written choices, allow time, and listen beyond speech, Arthur remained unmistakably himself. He recognized people. He understood documents. He reacted strongly to business news. He could point to figures, write fragments, and signal agreement or refusal with remarkable precision. But aphasia was a condition Leonard could exploit because it was easy to misunderstand. When Arthur struggled to answer a question in the hospital, Leonard would gently explain that his uncle had become confused. When Arthur tried to push away papers, Leonard would say he was agitated. When Arthur stared at a visitor with anger because he could not express what he wanted, Leonard would tell the visitor that the stroke had changed him. The people around Arthur were not cruel. Most were simply busy, worried, and unfamiliar with the difference between a person who cannot communicate in the usual way and a person who cannot think. Leonard made that confusion useful. Within days, he arranged for himself to control Arthur's schedule. Visitors had to be approved through Leonard's office. Phone calls were screened. Longtime employees who came to see Arthur were told that he needed quiet. Board members received carefully edited medical summaries. Even Arthur's home staff were warned that too much stimulation could endanger his recovery. Every restriction sounded reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a wall. Naomi Reed saw the wall before anyone else did. She had not been a senior executive at Ren Meridian. She had never attended shareholder dinners or appeared in annual reports. For most of her career, Naomi had worked in the Records and Preservation Department, a small office in the oldest building on the company campus. Her work involved minutes from board meetings, trust amendments, land deeds, historical contracts, environmental reports, employee pension records, and the delicate task of deciding what should be protected when everyone else wanted more space. It was work that made powerful people impatient. They wanted files quickly. They wanted old disputes forgotten. They wanted signatures without context and summaries without inconvenient attachments. Naomi had learned that the most important document in a room was often the one someone called outdated. She had come to Ren Meridian in her 20s after her father injured his back at the factory and could no longer work steady shifts. Her father had been proud of the company even when it failed him. He kept a photograph of Arthur shaking hands with a line of welders after a contract victory. And he told Naomi that men like Arthur were rare because they still remembered the names of people who worked below them. Naomi did not romanticize the company. She knew its history included mistakes, layoffs, and decisions that hurt people. But she also knew Arthur and his late wife, Beatrice, had spent decades trying to build safeguards against the kind of greed that could erase a company's conscience in a single board meeting. Beatrice had been the first person at Ren Meridian to treat Naomi's work as something more than storage. She had a scholar's mind and a practical understanding of human weakness. She believed that people often behaved honorably when circumstances were easy, but true character appeared when money, illness, inheritance, and fear entered the same room. Years before Arthur's stroke, Beatrice had begun building a separate system for critical records. She called it the Lantern Archive because, in her words, hidden things should have a light kept for them. The archive was not a secret fortune or a private collection of gossip. It contained certified copies of documents that could matter if family pressure, corporate pressure, or medical crisis ever placed Arthur's intentions at risk. Arthur agreed because he understood what Beatrice was protecting. He had seen families tear themselves apart over a will. He had seen elderly founders surrounded by advisors who suddenly became experts on what was best for them. He had seen how quickly a person's own wishes could disappear once people decided that age, illness, or slow speech made those wishes inconvenient. The Lantern Archive was lodged not in Ren Meridian's offices, but in the county's restricted records repository. The company kept reference copies, but the certified originals were stored under a protocol requiring a court order, an independent records officer, and a documented chain of custody. Naomi had helped organize the material, but she could not open it alone. No one could. That was the point. Leonard knew the archive existed. Naomi was certain of it. He had attended the meeting years earlier, when the capacity safeguards were discussed. Although he had acted bored at the time, he had called them overly cautious and expensive. Beatrice had smiled politely, then asked that his objection be entered into the minutes. After Arthur's stroke, the first sign that Leonard was moving against Naomi came quietly. 2 folders vanished from the company records room. They were not dramatic files. One contained old board resolutions related to Arthur's voting shares. The other held correspondence about the Lantern Archive. Naomi noticed because she knew every box number and accession date. When she asked the new compliance manager about the missing folders, she was told that Leonard had ordered a document review. 3 days later, Naomi was informed that her position had been eliminated in a restructuring. The letter was efficient and cold. It praised her long service, offered a severance package, and required her to return all company property. It also contained a warning that unauthorized retention or disclosure of internal materials could lead to legal action. Naomi understood the message beneath the formal language. Leonard was not simply removing her from payroll. He was making sure that if she spoke up, people would assume she had stolen something. She went home that afternoon carrying an empty cardboard box. In the box were a framed photograph of her father a small brass paperweight shaped like a lantern, and a note Beatrice had written years earlier after Naomi stayed late to recover a damaged pension ledger. The note thanked her for believing that records were a form of respect. For 2 weeks, Naomi did nothing, not because she did not care, but because she knew that rushing toward a man like Leonard would only give him the story he wanted. He needed her to appear emotional, resentful, and unstable. He needed the court to see a dismissed employee rather than a witness to something larger. Then Arthur's old driver called her from a number she did not recognize. The driver had worked for Arthur for 27 years. He sounded frightened. Leonard had reassigned him, but he had seen Arthur during a transfer between appointments. Arthur had struggled to hold a notepad. On it, he had drawn a rectangle, a red circle, and a small lantern. The driver did not understand, but he remembered Naomi had once spoken about old company records. He thought she might. Naomi understood immediately. The rectangle was a document box. The red circle was a seal. The lantern was the archive. She contacted Daniel Park, the attorney the probate court had appointed to represent Arthur's interests in the guardianship case. Daniel was not Leonard's lawyer and not Naomi's ally. He was a careful attorney with a reputation for taking difficult cases seriously. But when Naomi first called, he sounded tired. He had already reviewed the medical report from Dr. Martin Vale, a respected neurologist who concluded that Arthur could not make complex decisions. He had also listened to Leonard's account of a confused old man being manipulated by a former employee. Daniel agreed to meet Naomi only because Arthur's driver had independently confirmed the strange drawing. Naomi did not try to impress him. She did not pretend to have answers she did not possess. She placed copies of her employment records, the severance letter, the archive protocol, and a timeline of missing files on the table between them. She explained what aphasia was. She explained why a hurried verbal examination could not determine whether Arthur understood financial decisions. And she explained that the Lantern Archive might contain documents relevant to any attempt to take control of Arthur's property. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked the question Leonard had wanted everyone to ask. Why should anyone believe a fired records employee over a nephew, a doctor, and a board of directors? Naomi answered that they should not believe her because she was fired. They should verify the record because the record either existed or it did not. That answer changed something. Daniel checked the county repository. The Lantern Archive was real. Its access conditions were real. And most importantly, a limited request for emergency guardianship had been filed by Leonard only 48 hours after the first scheduled board discussion of the Horizon Vale sale. The timing did not prove wrongdoing, but it made the request impossible to ignore. The guardianship petition was written to sound compassionate. It described Arthur as vulnerable, confused, and unable to understand the consequences of business decisions. It argued that without a responsible family member in charge, Arthur's health and assets could be endangered. Leonard offered himself as the obvious solution. He claimed he had no conflict of interest because he sought no personal gain and only wished to preserve the company his uncle loved. What the petition did not mention was the vote. Arthur's shares represented enough voting power to block the sale of the housing division. If a guardian controlled those shares, the board could approve the deal. If the deal went through, Horizon Vale would pay advisory fees to several outside firms. One of those firms, according to a thin thread Daniel found in public business filings, was connected to a company called Northwatch Strategies. Northwatch Strategies had been formed 6 months earlier by Leonard's former college roommate. It had no public website, no employees listed beyond a mailing address, and no history of major consulting work. Yet it had suddenly been named as a strategic transition advisor in preliminary documents related to the potential sale. Daniel did not accuse Leonard immediately. He knew better. A suspicious company was not proof. A coincidence was not proof. But the pattern was beginning to form. The day before the probate hearing, Daniel petitioned Judge Imani Cole for authority to inspect the Lantern archive under the court's supervision. Leonard objected through his counsel, arguing that old documents would only distract from Arthur's present medical condition. He also claimed that Naomi had manufactured the entire issue because she resented losing her job. Judge Cole did not approve a full release. She allowed a narrow preliminary inspection by the county records officer, Daniel, and counsel for both sides. Naomi could attend only as a factual witness because she had helped organize the archive. The limitation frustrated her, but it also protected the process. The evidence had to survive more than outrage. It had to survive scrutiny. At the county repository, the red-sealed box was brought from a climate-controlled shelf behind 2 locked doors. The records officer read the accession number aloud. Daniel verified it against the court order. Leonard's attorney watched every movement. Naomi stood with her hands folded, afraid to breathe too loudly. Inside the box were several folders, each stamped with dates and certification marks. The first contained Arthur's Capacity Safeguard Directive, executed 7 years earlier. It did not declare that Arthur would always be competent. It did something more careful. It required that if he ever suffered a condition affecting speech or conventional communication, any assessment of his decision-making ability had to include a qualified specialist familiar with supported communication methods. It also required that no family member with a financial interest in a pending corporate transaction could be appointed to control his voting shares without an independent review. Leonard's attorney dismissed the directive as old planning material. Daniel did not. The document was signed, witnessed, and properly certified. More damaging still, Leonard's name appeared on the final page. He had signed as an acknowledging witness. The second folder contained a limited trust amendment. Arthur had placed a portion of his controlling shares into a protective arrangement designed to prevent a guardian from using temporary medical vulnerability to force a corporate transaction. If Arthur could not communicate, the shares were not to be handed automatically to a relative. They were to be placed under a neutral fiduciary until Arthur's capacity had been properly assessed through the protocol he had chosen. The third folder was more troubling. It included minutes from a private meeting held after Leonard had once asked Arthur to sign broad proxy forms during a period of illness 3 years earlier. Arthur had refused. Beatrice had insisted that the conversation be documented. The minutes did not call Leonard a criminal. They did not predict the future. They simply recorded that Arthur was concerned about pressure from people who might benefit from his inability to participate fully in company decisions. That concern had been sealed with the rest of the archive, because Beatrice believed it could become a family weapon if it were made public too soon. At the end of the inspection, the records officer discovered a fourth folder that had been marked for release only if a petition for guardianship was filed by a person named in the earlier documents. The folder was still sealed in red wax. That was the box Naomi carried into court. Leonard had not expected it to appear. He had expected the archive to remain locked behind procedure long enough for him to gain emergency control. He had expected Arthur's silence to do the work for him. And when he saw the red seal in Naomi's arms, He understood that the courtroom was no longer a place where he could control every question. Judge Cole did not open the sealed folder that first morning. She ordered a short evidentiary hearing, required the parties to submit the materials for verification, and appointed an independent communication specialist to evaluate Arthur. It was not the victory Naomi wanted, but it was the first time in 6 weeks that Arthur's condition would be examined without Leonard deciding what his silence meant. As court recessed, Leonard walked past Naomi without looking at her. His face had returned to its public expression of patience and grief, but his hands were clenched hard enough that the skin around his knuckles had turned pale. Naomi watched him leave and felt no satisfaction yet. The red seal had not proved anything. It had only bought time, and time was exactly what Leonard had been trying to steal. The 48 hours that followed were the longest Arthur had spent without Leonard controlling the story told about him. For the first time since the stroke, people entered his room without first asking Leonard whether the visit was necessary. The independent specialist appointed by Judge Cole was Dr. Alina Mercer, a neuropsychologist whose work focused on assessing decision-making ability in people with aphasia, traumatic brain injury, and other communication disabilities. She did not arrive with a stack of rapid-fire verbal questions and a stopwatch. She arrived with a tablet, written options, visual scales, financial summaries formatted in plain language, and the patience to let silence mean thought rather than failure. Dr. Mercer spent nearly 4 hours with Arthur over 2 sessions. She asked him to identify people he trusted, explain the purpose of his major holdings, recognize the difference between selling an asset and granting someone control over it, and indicate whether he understood the consequences of a guardian voting his shares. She used yes or no confirmation methods, written keywords, picture-supported questions, and repeated checks to make sure a gesture was not being misunderstood. Arthur was slow. Sometimes he became exhausted and had to stop. Sometimes a word appeared on his screen only after several attempts, but the substance of his answers was consistent. He knew the value of his principal assets. He knew the proposed Horizon Vale transaction. He recognized Leonard's role in it. He understood that a guardian could make choices he did not want. And when asked whether he wanted Leonard to control his health decisions or voting shares, Arthur rejected that choice with a clarity that no one in the room could honestly misread. That conclusion did not end the case. Leonard's lawyers argued that capacity could fluctuate and that the complexity of a corporate sale required more than basic understanding. They suggested that Arthur's refusal of Leonard was emotional, influenced by Naomi, and not a reason to leave important decisions unprotected. Their strategy was subtle. They no longer needed to prove Arthur was completely unaware. They only needed to persuade the judge that fear and complexity justified taking control away from him. Daniel began with the independent report. He walked the court through the difference between speech impairment and impaired reasoning. He emphasized that Arthur did not need to prove that he could speak like he had before the stroke. He needed only to show that he could understand and communicate decisions through methods appropriate to his condition. The law was not supposed to reward people for refusing to provide the support that would allow a disabled person to be heard. Leonard's attorney attacked the report carefully. He pointed to Arthur's fatigue. He questioned whether visual aids had made the answers too simple. He noted that Dr. Mercer had met Arthur after Naomi raised concerns, implying that the entire evaluation had been shaped by a former employee's agenda. He tried to turn every accommodation into proof of manipulation. Dr. Mercer did not become defensive. She explained that accommodations did not put thoughts into Arthur's mind. They removed barriers that prevented other people from hearing thoughts already there. She explained that a person using glasses was not being coached to see, and that a person using an interpreter was not being coached to speak. The same principle applied to supported communication. At first, Dr. Vale appeared confident. He had years of clinical experience and a respected private practice. His original assessment was concise, formal, and built around familiar categories. Arthur had failed to answer certain verbal questions quickly. He had struggled to repeat phrases. He had become frustrated during testing. Dr. Vale had concluded that these failures indicated substantial cognitive decline. Daniel did not accuse him of lying. Instead, he asked what methods he had used to distinguish aphasia from loss of executive function. Dr. Vale acknowledged that he had not used a communication board, written choice assessment, extended response time, or consultation with a speech-language specialist. He said the setting had been urgent and that he relied on professional judgment. Daniel then asked whether Leonard's office had arranged the assessment and whether Leonard had remained nearby during portions of the examination. Dr. Vale said yes. He explained that Leonard had been concerned about Arthur's agitation and wanted the process completed quickly. The next question changed the air in the room. Daniel asked whether Dr. Vale had disclosed a consulting agreement between his clinic and Northwatch Strategies. The agreement had been found in documents produced after the court ordered a limited financial disclosure. It was not a direct payment for the guardianship opinion. That would have been too obvious. Instead, Northwatch had retained Dr. Vale's clinic months earlier to provide executive wellness consulting for a future transition project. The work had not yet begun in any meaningful way, but the contract promised a substantial fee if the Horizon Vale transaction closed. The capacity directive from the Lantern Archive showed that Leonard had known about the safeguards. The trust amendment showed he could not automatically control Arthur's shares if he stood to gain from a pending transaction. But Leonard continued to deny that he had any personal interest in the Horizon Vale sale. He claimed Northwatch was an outside consultant chosen by the buyer. He claimed he had no ownership in it, no promised payment, and no reason to want the vote outcome beyond the good of the company. Then Daniel introduced the records obtained through the court-supervised review of Ren Meridian's transaction files. They were not sensational documents. There was no single email in which Leonard confessed to stealing from Arthur. There was no recording of him laughing about his uncle's stroke. The truth arrived in the way real financial deception often arrived, through dates, signatures, spreadsheets, and words that had been chosen too carefully. The first document was an early draft of the Horizon Vale term sheet. In its original form, Northwatch was listed as an independent transition advisor. In a later version, a small notation appeared in the payment schedule. It referred to an incentive allocation for a beneficial participant identified only by initials. Daniel displayed a separate compliance questionnaire signed by Leonard during negotiations. On that form, Leonard had answered that he had no direct or indirect financial interest in any outside party connected to the transaction. The initials in the incentive schedule matched Leonard's full legal name. Leonard's attorney objected immediately. He argued that initials were ambiguous. Daniel agreed that, standing alone, they could mean many things. He then introduced a second document, a private side letter between Northwatch and a holding company called Hale Family Ventures. The holding company was not listed on Ren Meridian's public disclosures, but corporate registration records showed that it was controlled by a trust established for Leonard's children. The side letter promised that if the sale closed, Hale Family Ventures would receive a percentage of Northwatch's success fee. The payment would not go directly into Leonard's personal account. It would flow through a family trust designed to make the connection difficult to see at a glance. That was not merely a conflict of interest. It was the exact type of indirect financial benefit Arthur's trust amendment had been created to prevent. Leonard's expression did not collapse. He was too disciplined for that. But the rhythm of his composure changed. He began consulting with his lawyer more often. He stopped looking at Arthur. And for the first time, the people who had believed his story could see the outline of the trap he had built. Daniel continued. The next record showed that the guardianship petition had been prepared using information from a draft proxy package. The proxy package was dated 4 days before Leonard filed in court. It assumed that someone other than Arthur would control his voting shares at the upcoming board meeting. It did not name Leonard directly, but the instructions matched the authority he sought in the guardianship petition. Leonard had not simply responded to a medical crisis. He had begun arranging the corporate consequences of Arthur's incapacity before a judge had ever examined whether Arthur was incapable. Judge Cole asked whether there was evidence Leonard had discussed the proxy plan before Arthur's stroke. Daniel said there was not. He did not exaggerate. The court could not punish a man for plans that had not been proven. But the sequence after the stroke was enough to show urgency of a different kind. Leonard had treated Arthur's illness as an opportunity before he treated it as a human tragedy. At that point, the county records officer was called forward with the final red-sealed folder from the Lantern archive. The procedure was slow by design. The officer identified the accession number, confirmed the court order, and described the condition of the seal. Daniel and Leonard's counsel examined it. Judge Cole asked whether either party disputed that the seal had remained intact since it was placed in county custody. Neither did. When the officer broke the wax, the sound was quiet. It was not the sound of a dramatic weapon being drawn. It was the sound of a barrier giving way after years of pressure. Yet every person in the courtroom heard it, because Leonard had spent the entire case trying to make sure that folder remained closed. Inside was a memorandum prepared jointly by Arthur and Beatrice 7 years earlier, along with a notarized statement from the attorney who had advised them at the time. The memorandum described an incident involving blank proxy forms and a proposed transfer of authority. Leonard had approached Arthur during a period of illness following surgery and urged him to sign documents that would allow Leonard to act quickly in corporate matters. Arthur had refused after reading the papers. Beatrice had been disturbed enough to insist on a written record. The memorandum did not claim Leonard had committed a crime then. It stated that Arthur believed Leonard had minimized the scope of the proxy forms and had become angry when asked to wait for independent counsel. Because the family chose not to make the matter public, the documents had been stored in the Lantern archive as part of Arthur's future capacity planning. Attached to the memorandum was a statement of intent signed by Arthur. It said that if any future health condition limited his speech or mobility, he wanted the people around him to distinguish between inability to perform quickly and inability to decide. It stated that he did not want Leonard appointed as guardian, proxy, conservator, or controller of his voting shares without an independent review, particularly if Leonard could benefit from a company transaction. Leonard had signed an acknowledgement that he had received notice of this statement. That signature was the moment his defense became almost impossible to sustain. For weeks, he had told the court he believed he was the natural person to take charge, because Arthur had never expressed any other preference. He had sworn that he knew of no binding instructions limiting his role. Now the court had certified documents showing that he knew exactly what Arthur wanted and had been warned years earlier that he was not to use illness as a path to control. The damage went beyond the guardianship case. It reached his credibility in every statement he had made under oath. Judge Cole did not rush to pronounce judgment. She reviewed the materials, asked questions about dates, and gave Leonard's attorney time to respond. The lawyer argued that the old memorandum reflected a family disagreement, not a legal finding. He argued that Leonard's signature on an acknowledgement did not mean he remembered every provision years later. He argued that his client's concern for Arthur could still be genuine, despite an undisclosed financial interest. Some of those arguments were not absurd. That was what made the case important. Justice did not require pretending that every difficult family conflict had a simple villain. It required looking at the entire pattern. The pattern was what condemned Leonard. Arthur's speech had been impaired, but he had been denied meaningful accommodations. Leonard had sought emergency control at the exact moment Arthur's shares mattered most. Leonard had withheld capacity safeguards that named him as a conflicted party. His doctor had failed to disclose a financial relationship connected to the transaction. A hidden family trust stood to profit from the sale. And the sealed record established that Leonard had been warned years earlier that Arthur feared exactly this kind of pressure. Taken together, it was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Before Judge Cole issued her decision, she asked Arthur whether he wished to make his own preference known. Arthur's communication tablet rested on the table in front of him. Dr. Mercer sat nearby but did not touch it. Arthur looked at the screen for a long time. His left hand moved slowly, selecting letters one by one. He paused. He deleted a letter. He began again. No one hurried him. No one interpreted the silence for him. For the first time since his stroke, the entire room waited for Arthur at Arthur's pace. When he finished, Dr. Mercer verified the message with him using a second method. Arthur confirmed that he did not want Leonard to make decisions for him. He confirmed that he wanted independent assistance while recovering. And he confirmed that he wanted the housing division protected until he could participate fully in any decision affecting it. The meaning was simple. Arthur had never asked to be rescued from his own life. He had asked to be heard. Judge Cole denied Leonard's petition for emergency guardianship. She found that Arthur had demonstrated decision-making capacity with appropriate supports, and that Leonard's undisclosed financial interests created a serious conflict. She ordered that no one could exercise authority over Arthur's personal voting shares without further court approval. She directed the parties to implement a supported decision-making plan, including access to independent medical, legal, and communication professionals. She also ordered the record transmitted to the appropriate authorities for review of possible false statements in the guardianship petition, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and financial misconduct connected to the proposed transaction. The order did not declare Leonard guilty of crimes. It did something more immediate and more devastating. It removed his ability to hide behind the appearance of concern. The court had not sent him away in handcuffs. There was no satisfying instant punishment, no sudden collapse under flashing cameras. Leonard left the courtroom surrounded by lawyers, his face pale and controlled. But the world he had built depended on people believing that he was trustworthy. That belief had been broken in public by the very process he had tried to use as a weapon. The consequences unfolded over the following months. Ren Meridian's board placed Leonard on administrative leave while an independent investigation began. Several directors who had accepted his version of events admitted that they had not asked enough questions about Arthur's condition or the Horizon Vale proposal. The sale was halted. The company's compliance office discovered that Northwatch had been included in internal planning long before it had been properly disclosed. Investigators traced the expected success fee through Hale Family Ventures and found additional communications showing that Leonard had pressed staff to speed the guardianship filing before the board vote. Dr. Vale faced a separate professional review. His report was not treated as worthless simply because it was inconvenient. Medical errors and conflicts needed evidence, not anger. But reviewers concluded that he had failed to use appropriate methods for a patient with aphasia and had not disclosed a material financial connection. His opinion was formally withdrawn from the guardianship case, and his clinic lost several institutional contracts that depended on public trust. Leonard's legal troubles took longer, as real legal troubles often did. Financial records had to be examined. Witnesses had to be interviewed. Lawyers argued over intent, disclosure rules, and the difference between poor judgment and criminal deception. But the investigation did not disappear. It grew. And the same careful documentation Leonard had believed he could control became the trail that followed him. Arthur did not return overnight to the man he had been before the stroke. Recovery was uneven. Some days, speaking remained exhausting. Some days, he grew angry at the patience his new life required. But the difference was that no one used those difficult days as permission to take away his choices. With Dr. Mercer's support, Arthur learned new communication tools. He began attending shortboard sessions remotely, reviewing materials in advance, and responding through a combination of typed notes, visual summaries, and scheduled breaks. The first time he voted against reopening negotiations with Horizon Vale, he did so slowly and unmistakably. The board secretary recorded the vote. No one called it confusion. He also made a decision that surprised many people. Instead of simply preserving the housing division under his personal control, Arthur transferred a significant share of it into a community benefit structure. Employees, tenant representatives, and an independent public interest board received defined oversight roles. The arrangement did not solve every problem. It did not turn a corporation into a perfect institution, but it made it harder for one ambitious executive to sell a mission built by thousands of people without answering to those people. Naomi refused the public attention that came afterward. Reporters tried to describe her as a hero, but she disliked the word. Heroes, she thought, were often used to make ordinary responsibility sound extraordinary. She had only done what her work had taught her to do: preserve what mattered, ask what was missing, and refuse to let a person be erased because listening required effort. Arthur asked her to return to Ren Meridian, not as an assistant and not as a symbolic employee. He offered her the role of director of the newly expanded Lantern Archive and its companion advocacy program. The program would help families understand supported decision-making, protect older adults from financial exploitation, and teach organizations how to communicate with people whose disabilities made them easy to dismiss. Naomi accepted only after insisting on one condition. The program could not exist merely to polish the company's image. It had to serve people who had no connection to Ren Meridian and no ability to repay the help. Arthur agreed. A year later, the Lantern Center opened in a restored building near the old factory. Its walls held photographs of workers, copies of historical agreements, and shelves of records that many executives would once have called obsolete. There were meeting rooms for families, legal clinics staffed by volunteers, communication resources for stroke survivors, and a quiet reading room where Naomi kept Beatrice's brass paperweight beneath a glass case. Arthur attended the opening. He spoke only a few words, each one hard-earned. But he did not need many. The people in the room waited for him. That was the difference. Naomi stood near the archive room afterward and watched a young woman help her grandfather use a tablet to fill out a form. The older man took his time. No one reached for the device to answer in his place. No one called him confused because the silence lasted longer than expected. Naomi thought about the first morning in court, when Leonard had tried to make her look like the problem. He had underestimated her because her work was quiet. He had underestimated Arthur because his speech was slow. He had underestimated records because he believed power belonged to whoever held the microphone. But truth did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waited in a sealed box. Sometimes it lived in a forgotten signature. Sometimes it survived because an ordinary person refused to throw away what others wanted erased. The lesson of Arthur Wren's case was not that every wealthy family hid a villain behind a polished smile. It wasn't that illness always revealed betrayal. The deeper lesson was that dignity depends on more than the ability to speak quickly, look powerful, or defend yourself in the language others expect. A person can be silent and still be certain. A person can be disabled and still deserve control over their own life. And whenever someone insists that another human being is too weak to be heard, we should ask who benefits from the silence. Because the most dangerous people are not always the ones who shout. Sometimes they are the ones who speak softly while reaching for someone else's voice. And sometimes, all it takes to stop them is one person willing to preserve the truth until the moment the world is finally ready to listen.
Step away from that Ferrari before I make this worse for you.
Malcolm Reed did not move an inch.
You already made it worse when you decided I could not own it.
His appearance told Vanessa everything she assumed.
A man like you does not arrive here in a car like that.
But Malcolm gave her one quiet warning.
Be very careful with the story you are about to tell.
Vanessa turned suspicion into a public accusation.
Someone call security! This man is trying to steal from my company!
The valet knew the truth was nearby.
Ma'am, I think you should look at the registration first.
Vanessa made sure he could not speak.
One more word, and you will lose this job tonight.
Malcolm protected him without raising his voice.
Do not punish him for telling the truth.
The truth is obvious. He does not belong beside a Ferrari.
The crowd watched Vanessa judge him openly. Still, Malcolm never looked afraid. Then police lights washed over the Ferrari.
Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Before you touch me, you may want to call your superiors.
But Malcolm's silence had a history. To understand why Malcolm Reed stood there so still while a woman tried to turn his life into a crime scene, you have to understand that he had survived far worse than being underestimated. He had built his entire life in rooms where people looked at him last, listened to him least, and then acted surprised when his ideas saved them. Malcolm had been born in a neighborhood where broken engines were more common than working streetlights, and where boys learned early that the world often noticed their mistakes faster than their talent. His father had driven buses for nearly 30 years. His mother cleaned offices and buildings where the executives never learned her name. But in their small garage behind the house, Malcolm found a language that did not care about status. Engines either worked or they did not. Metal either fit or it failed. A machine could be understood if a person had patience, discipline, and the humility to listen. As a child, Malcolm could not afford model cars, so he drew them. He sketched the curves of Italian sports cars from old magazines other people threw away. He studied the way light moved across the hood of a Ferrari, the way every line seemed to be a decision made by someone who understood speed as both science and poetry. But he did not love cars because they were expensive. He loved them because they were proof that imagination could become something real enough to touch. While other boys dreamed of owning a Ferrari, Malcolm dreamed of understanding why one existed at all. He wanted to know how beauty and engineering could meet in one object so perfectly that even a stranger on the sidewalk would stop breathing for half a second. That obsession carried him out of the neighborhood, through scholarships, late-night jobs, and years of being the only person in the room who looked like him. He became an engineer first, then a designer, then a businessman almost by accident. People who understood cars trusted him. People who understood numbers eventually had no choice but to respect him. But Malcolm never chased attention. Attention to him was a noisy room where people applauded before they understood the cost of what they were praising. He preferred quiet ownership. He preferred to build things and let others stand beneath the lights. It was a habit born partly from humility and partly from pain. The person who understood that pain best was his wife, Eleanor Reed. Eleanor had met Malcolm before anyone called him brilliant, before investors returned his calls, before his first company appeared in financial magazines. She had met him when he still carried engine grease under his fingernails and apology in his posture, as though the world had taught him to take up less space than he deserved. Eleanor never saw him that way. She saw the mind behind the quiet. She saw the patience behind the restraint. She saw a man who could walk past a showroom window and describe, from memory, how the car inside breathed. For years, Malcolm and Eleanor built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and extraordinary from within. She taught high school literature. He worked impossible hours in the automotive industry, first repairing what others broke, then designing systems that made luxury dealerships more efficient, more honest, and more profitable. He believed the car business did not have to be built on arrogance. He believed that people buying a dream should not be cheated by those selling it. Eleanor believed in him so completely that when he hesitated to start his own company, she placed a notebook on the kitchen table and filled the first page with the name she thought belonged to his future. Reed Caldwell Automotive Group. Caldwell was not Malcolm's name. It belonged to Richard Caldwell, a charming investor with old money, perfect teeth, and the kind of confidence that opened doors before he knocked. Richard had the connections Malcolm lacked. Malcolm had the vision Richard could never have invented. Together, they launched what would eventually become Caldwell Prestige Motors, a chain of high-end dealerships known for rare European cars, white glove service, and a reputation so polished that wealthy customers trusted it before reading the contracts. In the early days, Malcolm believed partnership meant shared purpose. He learned later that some people use partnership as a polite word for taking what another person built. Richard Caldwell liked Malcolm's mind, but he did not like Malcolm's presence at the front of the company. Investors, Richard warned, were more comfortable with a familiar face. Clients, he suggested, expected a certain image. Malcolm heard the meaning beneath every careful phrase. He had heard it his whole life. So he stayed behind the curtain and built the systems, trained the staff, negotiated the supplier relationships, and designed the customer ethics policy that became the company's hidden strength. Richard smiled at ribbon cuttings. Malcolm made sure the lights stayed on. Then came the betrayal. It was not dramatic at first. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives as missing paperwork, delayed signatures, board meetings rescheduled without notice, legal language no one explains until it is too late. By the time Malcolm realized Richard had tried to push him out, the company was already wearing another man's name like a stolen suit. Eleanor wanted him to fight publicly. She wanted the world to know who had built the foundation beneath Caldwell's marble floors. Malcolm wanted justice too, but he also knew the cost of a public battle. He had seen what powerful men could do when they felt exposed. He chose a slower kind of justice, one that required patience, discipline, and the kind of silence most people mistake for surrender. With Eleanor's help, Malcolm protected what mattered. Through a private family trust, carefully structured before Richard understood what was happening, Malcolm retained controlling interest in the holding company behind Caldwell Prestige Motors. Richard kept the spotlight. Malcolm kept the keys. The arrangement was strange, but it worked. Malcolm stepped away from the public face of the company and built a private investment firm that quietly rescued businesses, funded scholarships, and supported young mechanics who reminded him of the boy he used to be. Richard Caldwell enjoyed fame until illness and debt consumed the last years of his life. After his death, the Caldwell name remained, but the real power never sat where outsiders thought it did. Eleanor was the only person who knew how much that silence had cost him. She knew that every time Malcolm entered one of his own dealerships and watched employees fail to recognize him, a small part of him had to choose peace over pride. She also knew he was not weak. He was waiting. Not waiting for revenge exactly, but for the right moment to turn ownership into protection. She used to tell him that wealth was only meaningful when it defended people who had none. Malcolm carried those words long after Eleanor became ill, long after hospital rooms replaced business meetings, long after the woman who had believed in him before the world did left him with more money than he wanted, and one promise he could not forget. The Ferrari came from that promise. Years before Eleanor died, she and Malcolm had walked past a private collection after a charity dinner. Inside, under warm museum lights, was a deep red Ferrari, 812 super fast, elegant and aggressive, a machine that seemed to be moving even while parked. Eleanor had smiled at the way Malcolm stopped talking mid-sentence. She had known he was not seeing status. He was seeing childhood, survival, and design brought together in one impossible shape. She had told him that one day, when he finally stopped hiding from the life he had earned, he should buy one in red, not because rich men did, but because the boy in the garage deserved to see his dream in color. Malcolm did not buy it while she was alive. During her illness, extravagance felt obscene. After her funeral, it felt empty. But on the first anniversary of her passing, he purchased the Ferrari through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust, not as a trophy, but as a memorial. He had her initials engraved inside the cabin, where only someone looking closely would notice. He drove it rarely, and only on days connected to purpose. The car was not a toy. It was a reminder that grief could travel with beauty, and that promises made in love did not expire when a heartbeat stopped. The night of the Meridian Auto Museum Gala was one of those days. Caldwell Prestige Motors was sponsoring the event, at least publicly. But the real money came from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The gala was meant to launch a scholarship program for underprivileged students entering automotive engineering and technical training. Malcolm had insisted the program focus not on polished applicants with perfect resumes, but on young people who had learned from broken engines, family sacrifice, and necessity. He wanted the scholarship to find the version of himself the world had nearly missed. Vanessa Caldwell had other priorities. She was not Richard Caldwell's daughter, though she allowed people to assume the connection when it helped her. She had married briefly into the extended Caldwell family, kept the name after the divorce, and built a career out of appearing indispensable to men who confused Polish with competence. Vanessa had been appointed interim CEO after a leadership scandal shook the company, and she treated the temporary position as though it were a throne. She understood luxury branding, media optics, and the social choreography of wealthy rooms. She did not understand loyalty. She did not understand craftsmanship. And she certainly did not understand the kind of quiet power that did not need to introduce itself. To Vanessa, Caldwell Prestige Motors was an image to be sold. She wanted to merge the company with a foreign luxury conglomerate that had no interest in Malcolm's ethics policies, scholarship commitments, or employee protections. The sale would have given Vanessa an enormous personal bonus and a permanent title in the new organization. It also would have gutted the foundation Malcolm had built. Customer service departments would be outsourced. Longtime mechanics would be dismissed. The scholarship fund would be renamed, reduced, and folded into a marketing campaign. Vanessa called it modernization. Malcolm saw it for what it was: extraction disguised as progress. For months, Malcolm had watched from a distance as reports crossed his desk. Customer complaints rose. Employees resigned. Warranty claims were delayed to improve quarterly numbers. A small transfer from the charity budget had been labeled as event preparation, then moved again through consulting fees. No single entry proved corruption by itself, but together they created a pattern. Malcolm had seen enough patterns in his life to know when a machine was beginning to fail. He did not rush. He asked his legal team to gather documents. He asked the board chair to observe quietly. And then he accepted the invitation to attend the Meridian Gala in person. He did not tell Vanessa he was coming. He did not ask for a reserved entrance. He did not request a security escort or a press announcement. He drove himself in the Ferrari because Eleanor would have laughed at the idea of him arriving in a chauffeured sedan to a scholarship created in her name. He wore a simple navy jacket, a white shirt, and the watch Eleanor had given him when their first company turned a profit. The watch was not flashy. Its value was sentimental, not obvious. That was how Malcolm preferred most things. At the museum, the evening was already glittering when he arrived. The building curved in glass and steel around a central hall filled with historic race cars, polished engines, and photographs of drivers who had risked everything for speed. Wealth moved through the room with practiced ease. Champagne glasses caught the light. Sponsors smiled for cameras. Young scholarship applicants stood near the edges, dressed in borrowed suits and careful dresses, trying not to look overwhelmed by a world that had rarely opened doors for them. Malcolm noticed them first. He always noticed the people standing at the edges. One of those young people was Jordan Ellis, a valet assigned to the front entrance for the evening. Jordan was 22, nervous, and trying hard to appear invisible. 3 years earlier, he had been one bad month away from dropping out of a technical training program when an anonymous grant paid his tuition balance. He never learned the donor's name, only that the grant came from a trust connected to automotive education. What Jordan did not know yet was that the man stepping out of the red Ferrari was the reason he had a uniform, a job, and a future still within reach. Jordan recognized the car before he recognized the man. Everyone did. The Ferrari seemed to gather attention as naturally as fire gathers heat. Malcolm handed over no performance, no boast, no demand for special treatment. He simply greeted Jordan with respect, asked whether the staff had been given a place to eat during the long event, and waited for the answer with the seriousness of someone who considered that question important. Jordan was so startled by the courtesy that it took him a moment to respond. Most guests treated valet workers as extensions of the curb. Malcolm treated him as a person whose comfort mattered. That small exchange might have passed unnoticed if Vanessa Caldwell had not been standing near the entrance, preparing for a photographer. She saw the Ferrari first, then Malcolm, then Jordan's uncertain expression. In the space of a few seconds, her mind arranged those details into the only story her prejudice could accept. The car was too rare. The man was too understated. The valet looked too nervous, and the gala was too important for her to risk embarrassment. Vanessa did not approach like a host welcoming a donor. She approached like a property owner finding a stranger near the silverware. Malcolm saw the change in her face before she spoke. He had seen it in boutiques, hotels, boardrooms, country clubs, and once in the lobby of a bank that held more of his money than the manager earned in a decade. It was the look of someone deciding that evidence was unnecessary because assumption felt more natural. Vanessa asked for proof before she asked for his name. She looked at his jacket, then at the Ferrari, then at the gathering crowd, as though she were protecting civilization from a clerical error. Malcolm could have ended the moment there. He could have given his full name, called the board chair, or let one of the wealthiest families in the city learn within seconds who he was. But he had not come to the gala to perform power. He had come to watch what Caldwell had become when it believed he was absent. So he did what he had done for most of his life. He stayed calm, offered the simplest truth, and watched carefully to see who would choose fairness when fairness was inconvenient. Vanessa failed that test almost immediately. Vanessa Caldwell had spent her career learning how to turn uncertainty into authority. She knew that in wealthy spaces, the person who sounded most offended often controlled the room. So when Malcolm Reed calmly explained that the Ferrari belonged to him, she treated his calmness not as evidence of innocence, but as arrogance. She insisted that the vehicle matched one recently serviced by Caldwell Prestige Motors, and because her company had sponsored the gala, she claimed a responsibility to protect its assets, its reputation, and its guests. The words sounded professional enough from a distance. Up close, they were something uglier, wearing a tailored suit. Malcolm listened without interruption. That made people uneasy. A guilty man, they expected, would panic. An innocent man, they assumed, would defend himself loudly. Malcolm did neither. He stood beside the Ferrari with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that raising his voice would only make certain people feel justified in fearing him. He removed the registration card from a leather folder and offered it to Vanessa. She glanced at it only long enough to dismiss it. The name on the paperwork did not satisfy her because it did not match the story she had already chosen. Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust meant nothing to her except another obstacle between her accusation and the public victory she wanted. The crowd grew thicker. Guests who had come to celebrate charity now lingered for scandal. A few recorded openly. Others pretended to check messages while angling their phones toward Malcolm's face. This was how humiliation multiplied in the modern world. It no longer needed a courtroom or a newspaper. It needed only a confident liar, a silent crowd, and a camera hungry enough to turn a human being into content before the truth had time to breathe. Jordan Ellis stood near the valet podium with his hands tight at his sides. He knew something was wrong. The man beside the Ferrari did not move like a thief. He had arrived openly, not in a rush. He had spoken kindly. He had known to ask about the staff meal, a detail no ordinary guest noticed. Most importantly, Jordan had seen the registration card. He had caught the name of the trust, and something about it stirred a memory from the tuition letter he had kept folded in a shoebox at home. The grant that saved his future had come from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The same words were on the card Vanessa had just refused to believe. Jordan wanted to speak, but fear trapped him. His supervisor had warned the valet staff before the event that Vanessa Caldwell did not tolerate embarrassment. Workers who caused trouble would not be invited back. For Jordan, losing this job meant more than missing a paycheck. It meant falling behind on rent, delaying certification, maybe returning to the same dead-end work he had fought to escape. He watched Vanessa sharpen her accusation, and shame burned in him because he understood how silence could become cooperation. Inside the museum, the gala continued without understanding that its true purpose was being threatened outside the doors. Young students stood near displays of vintage engines, while donors congratulated themselves for generosity. A large banner promised a new future for overlooked talent in automotive engineering. Malcolm had funded that banner. He had funded the scholarships, the mentorship program, and the equipment grants that would follow. Yet outside, the man whose money made the evening possible was being treated as the danger. Vanessa's suspicion quickly became performance. She reminded everyone within earshot that Caldwell Prestige Motors dealt in vehicles worth more than most homes and could not afford to ignore irregularities. She emphasized that the Ferrari was a rare model, that criminals often targeted events like this, and that responsible leadership required swift action. Every sentence made her sound less like a woman seeking truth and more like someone auditioning for applause. The fact that Malcolm remained composed only irritated her further. She needed him to look guilty. She needed fear in his eyes. She needed the crowd to see what she believed she saw. When museum security arrived, Vanessa did not present uncertainty. She presented conclusion. She described Malcolm as an unauthorized individual attempting to take control of a high-value vehicle connected to her company. The words were careful, polished, and poisonous. They avoided the crudeness of open prejudice while carrying the same conclusion. This man didn't belong here, and therefore his ownership must be impossible. Malcolm again offered documentation. Again, Vanessa's certainty moved faster than anyone's willingness to verify. Security asked Malcolm to step away from the vehicle. He did. That small act of cooperation seemed to disappoint the people waiting for drama. He did not reach into his pocket suddenly. He did not challenge them with anger. He simply stepped back, folded his hands, and asked that the documents be checked before anyone treated an assumption as fact. One guard looked embarrassed. Another looked toward Vanessa, as though her title mattered more than the paperwork in Malcolm's hand. That glance told Malcolm almost everything he needed to know about the culture she had created. Vanessa noticed it too. Power teaches some people to recognize hesitation and punish it before it becomes courage. She pressed harder, reminding the guards that the entire gala was under media coverage and that any delay could become a reputational disaster. What she did not mention was that she had already created the disaster. In her mind, reputation meant controlling how things looked, not whether they were right. The first police car arrived 10 minutes later. To the crowd, it felt like confirmation. People who had been unsure now adjusted their faces into expressions of concern. Police lights have a way of turning suspicion into a script, and once that script begins, many people stop asking who wrote it. Malcolm watched the officers approach. He had known this possibility from the moment Vanessa raised her voice. He had also known that his wealth, his documents, and his education might not protect him quickly enough if the wrong person decided that his calmness was defiance. The lead officer, Daniel Price, was not cruel in the theatrical way Vanessa was cruel. His danger was quieter. He arrived with the fatigue of a man who believed he had seen enough to trust shortcuts. Vanessa gave him her version first. She did it quickly, confidently, and with just enough corporate language to sound credible. She described the Ferrari as possibly stolen from company custody, Malcolm as evasive, and the registration paperwork as suspicious. By the time Malcolm was invited to explain, he was no longer a man beside his own car. He was a suspect, attempting to overcome a story already planted. Malcolm handed over his identification and the registration card. Officer Price studied them, then studied Malcolm, then looked at Vanessa. That sequence mattered. The documents should have been the center of gravity. Instead, the officer's eyes kept returning to the woman in the expensive dress, who seemed so certain. Malcolm recognized the old imbalance. Paper was supposed to speak equally for everyone, but in the real world, paper often needed a powerful person to read it honestly. Vanessa grew bolder when she sensed the officer's uncertainty. She claimed there had been internal alerts about inventory irregularities at a Caldwell service facility. That part was not entirely false, which made the lie more dangerous. There had been irregularities, but they were not caused by Malcolm. They were caused by Vanessa's own pressure on employees to move vehicles and records in ways that made quarterly reports look cleaner than they were. One of those records involved a Ferrari recently serviced under a trust account. Vanessa had seen the paperwork days earlier and ignored the owner's name because she was focused on something else, hiding the fact that charity funds and service charges had been shifted between accounts before the merger review. The Ferrari, in other words, was not evidence of Malcolm's crime. It was evidence of Vanessa's panic. But no one outside the museum knew that yet. All they saw was a black man being questioned beside a car they assumed belonged to someone richer, louder, and more expected. Officer Price asked Malcolm why he had come to the event. Malcolm explained that he had been invited. Vanessa challenged that immediately, claiming she had personally reviewed the VIP list and did not recall seeing his name. She made memory sound like proof. Malcolm did not argue. He simply provided the digital invitation stored on his phone. Vanessa leaned in, saw the donor access credential, and for the first time a flicker of concern crossed her face. It disappeared quickly, but Malcolm saw it. The credential did not list him as Malcolm Reed. It listed him under the name of the trust. That was by his own design. For years, he had preferred the work to be recognized, not the man behind it. But now the privacy that had protected his peace gave Vanessa room to attack him. She suggested the invitation could have been obtained improperly. She suggested the trust name could be used as cover. She suggested anything that kept her from admitting the simplest possibility, that she had been wrong from the beginning. A younger officer asked whether someone from Caldwell's headquarters could verify the service records. Vanessa answered before Malcolm could. She insisted that she was the highest-ranking Caldwell executive present, and that her judgment should be sufficient until the vehicle could be impounded. The word impounded moved through the crowd like a spark. Phones lifted higher. Jordan's face tightened. Malcolm looked toward the Ferrari, not because he feared losing it, but because the thought of that car being dragged away under suspicion felt like an insult to Eleanor's memory. He remembered the day the Ferrari arrived. He had stood alone in the delivery room, while the dealer representative explained features Malcolm already understood better than he did. The car had gleamed beneath the lights, but Malcolm had not touched the steering wheel right away. He had placed his hand on the seat beside him, imagining Eleanor there, teasing him for pretending not to be emotional. He had whispered nothing aloud. He had only breathed through grief and gratitude until both became too large to separate. Now Vanessa was turning that memory into evidence of theft, and the cruelty of it settled deeper than her words. Still, Malcolm remained calm. Not because he felt nothing, but because he felt too much to waste it on spectacle. He asked Officer Price to contact the registration authority, the insurer, and the attorney listed on the trust documents. He also asked that the vehicle not be touched until its ownership was verified. The requests were reasonable. Vanessa treated them as manipulation. She accused him of trying to delay accountability and warned the officers that sophisticated thieves often used paperwork to confuse law enforcement. That phrase pleased her. It made prejudice sound like expertise. The situation might have turned then if Jordan had found his courage sooner. He stepped forward halfway, then stopped when Vanessa's assistant, a thin man named Miles Voss, moved beside him and quietly reminded him that temporary staff were replaceable. Miles did not need to raise his voice. Fear does not require volume when the power imbalance is clear. Jordan swallowed what he knew and stepped back. Malcolm saw the exchange. He did not blame the young man. He had once been young enough to know how expensive courage could be. Inside the museum, the gala program was nearing the scholarship announcement. Vanessa was supposed to appear on stage in 15 minutes. She knew that if Malcolm was still outside, if police were still questioning him, if guests kept filming, the evening would become impossible to control. So she made the choice that revealed her more clearly than anything she had said. She urged the officers to remove him from the entrance before donors became uncomfortable. Not before the truth was verified. Not before paperwork was checked. Before donors became uncomfortable. That was the moment Malcolm understood that Vanessa had to be removed from Caldwell, not merely corrected. A person who valued donor comfort over human dignity could not be trusted with a scholarship fund built for overlooked students. A leader who saw humiliation as a branding problem could not protect employees who lacked power. Malcolm had come to observe. Vanessa had given him the answer. Officer Price asked Malcolm to place his hands where they could be seen while they sorted things out. The request was framed as procedure, but procedure can feel very different depending on whose body carries the risk. The crowd grew silent in the way crowds do when they know something wrong is happening, but want permission from authority before admitting it. Malcolm complied. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. He could feel Eleanor's initials inside the car behind him. He could feel old memories rising. The bank lobby, the hotel elevator, the showroom where a salesman once assumed he was the driver for someone else. Each memory carried the same message. Prove you belong. Prove you are not a threat. Prove you own what you built. Then Jordan finally moved. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. He stepped toward Officer Price with his hands trembling and explained that he had seen the registration card, that the trust name matched the scholarship donor materials, and that Malcolm had arrived as an invited guest. His voice shook, but truth does not need to be fearless to matter. Vanessa turned on him instantly. She accused him of interfering in a police matter and warned that his employment would be reviewed. The threat landed exactly where she aimed it. Jordan went pale, but he did not step back this time. That small act changed the air. One of the younger scholarship applicants inside the museum noticed the commotion through the glass. Then another. Soon, several students moved toward the entrance, drawn not by gossip, but by the uneasy recognition that the man outside looked more like their fathers, uncles, neighbors, and future selves than anyone on the gala stage. They had come to be celebrated by a company claiming to believe in overlooked talent. Now they were watching that company's acting CEO overlook truth in real time. Malcolm looked at Jordan with gratitude, but not surprise. Courage often begins as a whisper. He knew that. He also knew Vanessa would punish the young man if she survived the night with power intact. So Malcolm made one final request, this time not to the officer, but to the process itself. He asked that his attorney be contacted immediately and that the board chair of Caldwell Prestige Motors be informed that the trust's representative was being detained at the entrance of the event, funded by that same trust. Vanessa laughed at the phrase trust's representative, not loudly, but with enough contempt for those closest to hear. She thought Malcolm was dressing himself in legal language to escape consequence. She did not understand that he had just given her one last chance to pause before stepping over the edge. Officer Price, still unsure but increasingly aware that the situation was more complicated than Vanessa had claimed, allowed Malcolm to make a call. Malcolm did not call a friend to rescue him emotionally. He called Amina Pierce, the attorney who had protected his interests for 15 years and who had warned him that Vanessa Caldwell's ambition had finally become dangerous. He gave her only a few calm details: the museum entrance, the Ferrari, the attempted impound, the presence of police, and Vanessa's refusal to verify ownership. Amina did not need more. She had been waiting for the machine to expose its broken part. While they waited, Vanessa tried to reclaim control by moving the event forward. She instructed Miles to inform the stage manager that the scholarship announcement would be delayed due to a security issue. That phrase spread quickly through staff radios. Security issue. It sounded clean. It sounded neutral. It erased Malcolm's name, Vanessa's accusation, Jordan's courage, and the simple fact that the only danger present had been created by a woman who mistook her bias for leadership. Minutes passed. The crowd shifted. The police checked the license plate and found no stolen vehicle report. They checked Malcolm's identification and found no warrant, no record, no reason to restrain him. But Vanessa kept insisting that internal company records raised concern. She promised documentation from Caldwell's system, and Miles hurried to retrieve a tablet. When he returned, the record he showed listed the Ferrari as pending corporate hold. It looked official enough to confuse the officers. It was also false, altered that afternoon by someone using executive access. Malcolm saw the screen and understood. The accusation was no longer just prejudice, it was fraud being improvised in public. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Not into anger, not exactly, but into something colder. Disappointment, sharpened by certainty. Vanessa mistook it for fear and pressed forward, urging the officers to detain him until the discrepancy could be resolved. Officer Price reached for his cuffs, not with eagerness, but with the weary surrender of a man letting a flawed process carry him. Jordan stepped forward again, but a security guard blocked him. Several guests began recording closer. Vanessa's eyes brightened with victory. And in that suspended moment, as Malcolm Reed stood beside the Ferrari that carried his wife's initials, with one officer preparing to turn assumption into restraint, the glass doors of the museum opened behind the crowd. A woman in a gray suit entered with a leather case in one hand and the expression of someone who had not come to negotiate. Behind her walked Bernard Hayes, the board chair Vanessa had been trying to avoid for months, and Marisol Chen, Caldwell's chief financial officer, carrying a folder thick enough to end careers. Vanessa saw them and went still. Malcolm did not smile. He simply lowered his hands and waited for the truth to arrive. Amina Pierce did not need to raise her voice to take control of the entrance. Some people carry authority like jewelry, bright and decorative, meant to be noticed before it is useful. Amina carried it like a blade kept sharp in silence. She moved through the crowd without asking anyone to step aside, and still they did. Bernard Hayes followed with the exhausted look of a man who had ignored too many warning signs and was now watching them gather into proof. Marisol Chen kept her eyes on Vanessa, not with hatred, but with the clean sadness of someone who had finally confirmed what she had feared. Vanessa recovered first, or tried to. She spoke to Bernard as though this were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an uncooperative guest. She framed the police presence as a necessary precaution. She described Malcolm as evasive, the Ferrari as suspicious, and the altered company record as justification for every humiliating second that had passed. But her words no longer landed with the same force. Power depends on the room believing you are the highest authority present. Vanessa had just lost that illusion. Amina asked Officer Price to review the documents in her case before any further action was taken. This time, no one dismissed the paperwork. The first document established the Ferrari's ownership. The vehicle had been purchased legally, insured properly, and registered through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The VIN matched, the title matched, the insurance matched, the trust documents matched. There was no theft, no unauthorized possession, no legal basis for impoundment. The car belonged to the trust, and Malcolm Reed was its managing trustee. Officer Price's face changed as he read. It was not dramatic, but it was visible. The confidence he had borrowed from Vanessa drained away, leaving behind the discomfort of a man realizing he had nearly placed handcuffs on an innocent person because someone wealthy had sounded certain. He returned Malcolm's identification with a formality that could not repair the damage, but at least stopped it from growing. The younger officer looked relieved. The security guards looked away. Vanessa refused to surrender. She shifted from accusation to confusion, insisting that the internal Caldwell record still listed the car under corporate hold. Marisol Chen opened her folder. That was the moment Vanessa's fear became unmistakable. Marisol had spent weeks tracing irregular entries across Caldwell's systems. At first, She had believed the problem was sloppy management under pressure from the proposed merger. Then she found the charity transfers. Then, the delayed warranty reimbursements. Then, the executive overrides attached to vehicles used as collateral in internal reports. Finally, that afternoon, she saw the Ferrari record altered less than an hour before Malcolm arrived at the gala. The alteration had not been made by a clerk. It had been made through executive credentials assigned to Vanessa Caldwell's office. The crowd did not understand every technical detail, but they understood enough. They understood that the document Vanessa had used to justify suspicion had been changed from inside her own system. They understood that the man she had accused had shown real paperwork, while she had relied on a record that now looked manufactured. Most of all, they understood that the story they had been recording was not the one they thought. Their phones remained raised, but the mood behind them changed. Curiosity became recognition. Recognition became shame. Vanessa tried to blame Miles. Miles looked as though his soul had left him standing there with a tablet in his hands. For months, he had obeyed her, softened her threats into emails, arranged her meetings, and watched her treat fear as a management tool. Now, with police present and the board chair listening, loyalty became too expensive. He admitted that Vanessa had ordered him to pull the Ferrari service history and flag it before the gala, claiming she needed leverage over an unnamed trust donor who might oppose the merger. He had not known she would turn that flag into a police accusation. That did not make him innocent, but it made the machinery visible. Bernard Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Malcolm watched him carefully. Bernard was not a villain, but cowardice in a boardroom can create space for villains to operate. He had allowed Vanessa's aggression because profits had risen. He had accepted her explanations because asking harder questions would have delayed the merger. He had told himself that leadership sometimes required sharp edges. Now those sharp edges had been turned on the very person whose trust kept Caldwell alive. Amina then presented the second set of documents. These were not about the Ferrari. They were about control. The Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust held the controlling interest in Reed Caldwell Holdings, the private entity that owned the majority of Caldwell Prestige Motors. Through that trust, Malcolm Reed possessed the authority Vanessa had spent months pretending she held without limits. He was not a random guest. He was not merely a donor. He was not an outsider trying to impress anyone with a sports car. He was the hidden founder, the principal owner, and the final vote on the merger Vanessa had built her future around. The silence that followed was deeper than the earlier silence. Earlier, people had been quiet because they were waiting to see a man punished. Now they were quiet because they understood. They had watched the owner of the company be treated like a criminal by his own acting CEO. Vanessa stared at Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time made the world unfair to her. That is the strange arrogance of people who judge too quickly. They are not horrified by the harm they caused. They are offended that the person they harmed turned out to have power. In her face, Malcolm saw no real remorse, only calculation collapsing. She was not thinking about the insult to his dignity. She was thinking about the merger bonus slipping away, the board votes dissolving, the headlines forming, and the video evidence spreading faster than her lawyers could contain it. Malcolm finally spoke, but even then, he did not perform anger for the crowd. He made it clear, in a measured way, that the issue had never been whether he could prove he owned the Ferrari. The issue was what would have happened if he could not. What if he had been a mechanic, borrowing a customer's car with permission? What if he had been a young student from the scholarship program standing beside a vehicle he had been asked to move? What if he had been Jordan, or any worker whose documents were not enough to overcome a powerful person's assumption? Malcolm's calmness forced the crowd to confront the truth Vanessa had tried to hide behind procedure. The problem was not a misunderstanding. It was a system in which certain people were believed first, and others were forced to survive the consequences. Jordan stood near the valet podium, barely breathing. When Malcolm's eyes found him, the young man looked down, ashamed that he had hesitated. Malcolm did not let that shame settle. He acknowledged Jordan's courage in front of everyone, not as a dramatic reward, but as a correction. The first person at that entrance who had tried to protect the truth had not been a board member, an officer, or an executive. It had been a young valet with the most to lose. That fact embarrassed the powerful more than any speech could have. Vanessa attempted one last defense. She claimed she had acted out of concern for company property, but that argument collapsed under its own weight. Amina reminded the officers and the board that concern for property did not explain why Vanessa ignored valid registration, threatened a witness, pushed for impoundment before verification, or used an altered internal record. Marisol added the financial findings. Transfers from the scholarship event budget to consultant accounts tied to the merger campaign, delayed vendor payments hidden under administrative review, and pressure placed on employees who questioned the numbers. The Ferrari incident had exposed the pattern because Vanessa, in her haste to humiliate Malcolm, had reached for the same tools she used everywhere else: intimidation, optics, and manipulated records. Poetic justice does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives as a board chair asking for a badge to be surrendered. Bernard removed Vanessa as acting CEO on the spot, pending a formal investigation. The words were quiet, but they struck harder than any public insult she had thrown at Malcolm. The title she had used as a weapon disappeared in front of the same crowd she had tried to impress. Her access to company systems was suspended. The merger vote was postponed indefinitely. The police opened a separate inquiry into the altered record, and the charity fund she had treated as a branding tool was placed under independent protection by the trust she had mocked. Vanessa's face hardened as she realized there would be no graceful exit. Minutes earlier, she had wanted Malcolm removed from the entrance so donors would not feel uncomfortable. Now donors watched as she was escorted away from the gala she had planned to dominate. She had accused Malcolm of not belonging beside the Ferrari. In the end, she was the one who no longer belonged in the building. The same cameras she had welcomed for publicity captured her fall. The same crowd she had tried to command stepped back from her, as though arrogance itself had become contagious. Malcolm did not celebrate. That disappointed some people watching, but it revealed the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge would have demanded humiliation equal to the humiliation Vanessa had attempted. Justice required something more difficult and more lasting. Malcolm wanted the company repaired. He wanted the scholarship protected. He wanted employees free from fear. He wanted the students inside the museum to remember the night, not only as the night a powerful woman was exposed, but as the night a promise survived. The gala did not end. That was Malcolm's decision. Vanessa's removal created chaos, but Malcolm refused to let her failure become the students' punishment. After a delay, the guests were invited back into the main hall. The mood had changed completely. The champagne seemed less important. The speeches sounded thinner. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of charity now carried the uncomfortable knowledge that charity without dignity is only decoration. When Malcolm entered the hall, he did not enter like a conquering hero. He entered slowly, with Jordan beside him and Amina a few steps behind. The red Ferrari remained outside under the lights, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but of everything people had failed to see. Inside the museum, the scholarship applicants watched him with a different kind of attention. Earlier, some had wondered whether they belonged in such a polished room. Now they had seen the man who funded the room nearly thrown out of it. The lesson was painful, but it was also powerful. Belonging, they learned, is not always granted by the people guarding the door. Bernard Hayes took the stage first and admitted, with visible difficulty, that the evening's program had nearly been overshadowed by a failure of leadership. He did not reveal every legal detail, but he acknowledged enough for the room to understand that an apology was owed. Then Malcolm was introduced properly, not as a mysterious donor, not as a trust representative, but as the founder whose principles had shaped Caldwell before ambition distorted them. Some guests applauded too quickly, eager to move from discomfort to redemption. Malcolm let the applause fade before the room could use it to absolve itself. He did not give them the speech they expected. He did not describe his net worth. He did not tell a triumphant story about proving people wrong. Instead, he spoke about Eleanor. He spoke about a woman who believed talent often lives where opportunity refuses to look. He spoke about young mechanics who learn precision from necessity, about students who work night shifts before morning classes, about parents who sacrifice quietly so their children can build something better. He made the room understand that the scholarship was not a public relations gesture. It was a debt paid forward. As he spoke, the meaning of the Ferrari changed again. It was no longer merely a luxury car or even evidence in a public accusation. It became part of a love story. Malcolm explained, without turning grief into spectacle, that the car carried Eleanor's initials because she had taught him to honor the dreams he once felt embarrassed to admit. She had believed that a boy from a forgotten garage could one day own beauty without apologizing for it. The room grew still, not with scandal this time, but with tenderness. Even those who had recorded his humiliation lowered their phones. The scholarship recipients were announced one by one. Jordan was not on the original list because he had already received support through the technical grant program years earlier. But by the end of the evening, Malcolm expanded the initiative. A new fellowship would be created for working students already inside the automotive industry, young people balancing jobs, training, and family obligations. Jordan would become its first mentor trainee, with full tuition support, paid certification leave, and a permanent position in Caldwell's technical development program if he chose it. The announcement was not charity tossed at him for good behavior. It was recognition of what courage had revealed. In the weeks that followed, the video spread far beyond the city. At first, people shared the most dramatic clip. Vanessa accusing Malcolm, the police lights flashing against the Ferrari, the moment Amina arrived with documents. But as longer footage emerged, the conversation changed. Viewers noticed Jordan trying to speak. They noticed Malcolm offering paperwork again and again. They noticed how quickly the crowd believed suspicion when it was spoken by someone expensive. The story became bigger than a Ferrari, bigger than a CEO losing her title, bigger even than one man's vindication. It became a mirror. Caldwell Prestige Motors underwent a reckoning. Malcolm did not burn the company down. He rebuilt its foundation in public. The proposed merger was canceled. An independent audit confirmed misuse of event funds and improper manipulation of internal records. Vanessa faced civil claims, regulatory scrutiny, and the permanent collapse of the image she had curated so carefully. Miles cooperated with investigators and was dismissed from his role. Bernard Hayes resigned from the board after admitting that oversight had failed under his leadership. Marisol Chen was appointed interim president, not because she was flawless, but because she had chosen the truth when silence would have protected her career. The company changed in ways that mattered. Employees received a protected channel for reporting misconduct. Valet workers, porters, mechanics, and junior staff were included in dignity and escalation policies that were not just printed in handbooks, but enforced. Customer contracts were rewritten in plain language. Warranty claims were reviewed. The scholarship fund was expanded and placed under a separate board that included educators, technicians, and former recipients. Malcolm insisted that the people most often ignored by luxury businesses should have a voice in how those businesses measured integrity. As for the Ferrari, Malcolm kept driving it, but not often. He brought it to the museum once each year for the scholarship ceremony, parking it not behind velvet ropes, but near the student entrance, where young people could see it up close. He allowed them to ask questions about the engine, the design, the balance between power and control. He loved those questions because they came from curiosity, not envy. He wanted them to understand that beauty did not belong only to those born near it. It could be studied, built, earned, and honored. 1 year after the incident, a small plaque was installed at the Meridian Auto Museum beside the scholarship wall. It bore Eleanor Reed's name, Malcolm Reed's name, and a sentence simple enough to be remembered by everyone who passed it. It said that dignity is the first door opportunity must open. Malcolm stood before that plaque for a long time after the ceremony ended. No cameras surrounded him then. No crowd demanded a reaction. Jordan, now wearing a technician's jacket instead of a valet uniform, stood nearby and said nothing, because some moments are too full for speech. Malcolm thought about the night Vanessa tried to reduce him to a suspect beside his own car. He thought about the officers, the crowd, the phones, the silence. He thought about how close the truth had come to being delayed by confidence, title, and assumption. He knew that his wealth had helped protect him. His attorney had arrived. His documents had been recognized. His ownership had been too large to ignore. But he also knew that many people never get that kind of rescue. Their truth is smaller on paper, easier to dismiss, and less profitable for strangers to defend. That knowledge kept him humble. It also kept him working. Vanessa eventually faded from headlines, though consequences followed her longer than attention did. She tried to rebuild her reputation through carefully worded statements about stress, misunderstanding, and procedural confusion. But the public had seen too much. More importantly, investigators had seen enough. The world she had built out of image could not survive contact with evidence. For a woman who had valued reputation above character, the punishment was brutally fitting. She had spent years polishing a name while neglecting the truth beneath it. In the end, the name tarnished exactly where the truth had been ignored. Malcolm never said he forgave her publicly. He also never let bitterness become his legacy. Eleanor had taught him that justice should protect the future, not merely punish the past. So he chose to build, He built scholarships. He built protections. He built a company where a young worker could challenge an executive without risking everything. He built the kind of door he wished had opened more easily when he was young. And the red Ferrari remained what it had always been, no matter what Vanessa tried to make it. Not proof of arrogance, not an invitation to envy, not a symbol that one man had become better than anyone else. It was a promise kept. It was a reminder that a boy who once fixed engines under weak garage lights had lived long enough to honor the woman who believed in him. It was also a warning to anyone who judged ownership by appearance, intelligence by accent, dignity by clothing, or worth by the comfort of their assumptions. Because sometimes the quiet man beside the car is not lost. Sometimes he is not lucky. Sometimes he's not trying to impress anyone at all. Sometimes he is the one who built the road, paid for the lights, opened the doors, and still waits patiently to see who will treat him with respect before they know his name. So the next time you see someone standing where you do not expect them to stand, pause before you turn your assumption into a sentence over their life. The truth does not become smaller because it arrives quietly. Dignity does not disappear because someone powerful refuses to recognize it. And kindness, when protected by courage, can outlast arrogance every single time. If this story reminded you that no one should have to prove their humanity before being treated with respect, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell us in the comments whether you think Malcolm gave Vanessa exactly the justice she deserved.